When Terra was young, and humanity's light had nearly been extinguished beneath clouds of radioactive ash, long before the Great Crusade would carry Imperial eagles to distant stars, a figure emerged from the shadows of mankind's darkest age. The Emperor of Mankind, though he was not yet known by that title, stepped forth from millennia of hidden preparation to claim dominion over a dying world. His origins remain shrouded in mystery, even to the most learned historians of the 41st millennium. But what fragments of knowledge survive in the deepest archives of the Imperial Palace paint a picture of a being who had achieved mastery over genecraft and psychic manipulation. When Terra itself writhed in the death throes of the Age of Strife, the world he chose to unite was scarcely recognizable as humanity's birthright. Where once blue oceans had reflected clear skies, now seas of radioactive sludge lapped against shores of fused glass. The great cities of antiquity lay buried beneath kilometers of ash and twisted metal, their populations either extinct or devolved into savage tribes that worshipped the rusted hulks of ancient machines. Terra had become a graveyard of human ambition, a testament to how far the species could fall when science and reason gave way to superstition and endless war. Yet in this wasteland of broken dreams, pockets of civilization endured. The techno-barbarian kingdoms that had risen from humanity's ashes controlled territories measured not in continents, but in the reach of their weapons. The Indonesian bloc commanded vast swaths of what had once been called Asia, their warlords ruling from fortress cities built into the bones of dead arcologies. In the irradiated wastes of Europa, a dozen petty kingdoms waged eternal war over the remnants of ancient knowledge, each claiming descent from the scientists and generals of the lost Golden Age. But even as these kingdoms battled for supremacy over Terra's corpse, something far more significant was stirring in the hidden places of the world, a consciousness that had waited through 30 millennia of preparation for this precise moment to act. Archaeological evidence suggests that the being who would become the Emperor had been active throughout the Age of Strife, though never directly. Fragmentary records speak of advisors who appeared at crucial moments to guide certain warlords to victory, of mysterious benefactors who provided advanced technology to specific kingdoms, of prophets who preached unity and cooperation in the face of endless tribal warfare. The pattern becomes clear only in retrospect. For centuries, perhaps millennia, an intelligence of unimaginable patience had been positioning the pieces for what was to come. The scale of Terra's devastation cannot be overstated by modern standards. Radiation levels in some regions exceeded those found in the heart of active plasma reactors. Atmospheric toxicity made unprotected human life impossible across vast continents. The very DNA of Terra's remaining population had been corrupted by millennia of exposure to mutagenic compounds, creating bloodlines so genetically unstable that natural reproduction was becoming increasingly difficult. By any rational measure, humanity's homeworld was dying, and its children were dying with it. Yet the Emperor saw opportunity where others perceived only despair. In later ages, Imperial scholars would debate whether his emergence at precisely this moment represented extraordinary foresight or cosmic coincidence. The answer, like so much about the master of mankind, remains locked in the vaults of his own consciousness. What cannot be disputed is the revolutionary nature of what he proposed to accomplish. Unity, not the fragile alliances that warlords had forged and broken for thousands of years, but true unity, political, genetic, and spiritual. The complete integration of Terra's scattered populations under a single will, guided by a single vision, empowered by technologies that would restore humanity to its lost greatness. It was a concept so audacious that even the most ambitious techno-barbarian lords initially dismissed it as the fevered dream of another would-be conqueror. And perhaps they would have been right to dismiss it, had they understood the full scope of what the Emperor had been preparing in the hidden laboratories beneath the Himalayzian Mountains. Experiments that would soon give birth to warriors unlike anything Terra had ever seen. The first confirmed sighting of the Emperor dates to the early decades of the 30th millennium, when sensors in the Urals detected massive energy discharges, unlike anything in the techno-barbarians' arsenals. Reconnaissance forces sent to investigate found entire kingdoms that had surrendered without firing a shot, their leaders speaking in awed whispers of a figure who had demonstrated powers that made their most advanced weapons seem like primitive clubs. These early encounters followed a pattern that would become familiar. The Emperor would appear, demonstrate capabilities that transcended normal human understanding, and offer a choice between willing allegiance and inevitable conquest. But even as word of this mysterious unifier spread across Terra's wasteland kingdoms, none could have suspected that they were witnessing the opening moves of a campaign that would reshape not merely their world, but the entire galaxy. The Unification Wars were about to begin, and with them, humanity would take its first steps toward an empire that would span the stars, though the price of that unity would prove far higher than anyone, perhaps even the Emperor himself, could have anticipated. For in the gene forges hidden beneath Terra's mountains, the first of the Thunder Warriors were already awakening to consciousness, their enhanced bodies housing the genetic legacy that would define humanity's future and carry within themselves the seeds of their own inevitable doom. In the dying centuries of the Age of Strife, Terra's atmosphere bore witness to a peculiar phenomenon that would only later be understood as the first stirrings of unification. Across the planet's scarred continents, isolated kingdoms that had warred for millennia began to exhibit subtle changes in their technological capabilities and political structures. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a gradual but unmistakable pattern. Certain regions were experiencing what Imperial historians would later term guided evolution, technological advancement and political sophistication that defied the general trend of civilizational decay. The environmental conditions of Terra during this epoch make the survival of any advanced civilization seem miraculous by modern standards. Atmospheric radiation readings preserved in the archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus indicate that background radiation levels averaged between 200 and 400 rads per hour across most inhabited regions, levels that would prove fatal to unprotected humans within days. The legendary storms of the period, which techno-barbarian oral traditions remember as the Crimson Winds, were in fact massive atmospheric disturbances carrying radioactive particles across entire continents, transforming the very air into a weapon against human survival. Yet within this hellscape of poisoned air and irradiated soil, pockets of relative stability began to emerge with increasing frequency. The kingdoms that would later become the core territories of the emerging Imperium showed signs of technological renaissance that their neighbors could not match. In the territories that would become the European Administrative Zone, rulers began implementing infrastructure projects of unprecedented scope, water purification systems that could process the most contaminated groundwater, atmospheric processors that created pockets of breathable air around their fortress cities, and most remarkably, genetic therapy programs that began reversing the accumulated mutations of their populations. The Indonesic bloc presents perhaps the most compelling evidence of external guidance during this period. Historical records recovered from their data crypts describe a remarkable transformation that occurred over the span of merely 3 generations. Where their ancestors had scraped out survival in the ruins of ancient arcologies, the Indonesic rulers of the late 29th millennium commanded technological capabilities that allowed them to begin serious terraforming operations across their territories. Their military capabilities evolved from primitive projectile weapons to energy-based systems that utilized principles of plasma manipulation previously thought lost to human science. But the most intriguing aspect of these developments was not their sophistication, but their remarkable similarity across geographically isolated regions, as if the same guiding intelligence was orchestrating improvements across multiple kingdoms simultaneously. Statistical analysis of surviving records reveals patterns that contemporary observers could not have recognized. Between M29 and the early decades of M30, mortality rates in what would become core Imperial territories dropped by an average of 67%, while birth rates increased by 34%. More significantly, the rate of genetic mutation, which had been steadily climbing throughout the Age of Strife, began to decline for the first time in recorded history. These improvements were not gradual or natural. They occurred in discrete jumps that coincided with the appearance of mysterious advisors and benefactors in each affected region. The technological advancement patterns are equally revealing. Kingdoms that had struggled for centuries to maintain basic energy production suddenly developed fusion reactors of remarkable efficiency. Metallurgical techniques thought lost since the Dark Age of technology reappeared independently in dozens of separate locations. Most remarkably, genetic engineering capabilities began emerging across Terra with a sophistication that suggested access to databases and technologies that had supposedly been destroyed millennia earlier. Communication networks provide another crucial piece of evidence for coordinated development. While most techno-barbarian kingdoms remained isolated by the hostile environment and their own paranoia, certain territories began establishing long-range communication systems that utilized previously unknown transmission methods. These networks, which Imperial archaeotechnicians have identified as primitive versions of what would later become astropathic relay systems, allowed unprecedented coordination between distant regions. The military implications of these developments were profound. Kingdoms that had barely been able to maintain territorial integrity against mutant raiders and environmental disasters began fielding military forces equipped with power armor, energy weapons, and enhanced warriors whose capabilities far exceeded normal human limitations. The genetic enhancement techniques employed in these early programs would later be recognized as crude precursors to the technologies that would create the Thunder Warriors and, eventually, the Adeptus Astartes. Yet even as evidence mounted that some external force was guiding Terra's selective recovery, the true scope of the manipulation remained hidden. The scattered kingdoms that were being prepared for unity had no concept that they were pieces in a vast strategic game that spanned not decades but millennia. Perhaps the most telling indicator of external guidance was the philosophical evolution that accompanied technological advancement. Kingdoms that had embraced the brutal pragmatism necessary for survival in the Age of Strife began developing more sophisticated governmental structures and social policies. The concept of unity, not merely as a political alliance but as a fundamental restructuring of human civilization, began appearing in the rhetoric and policy documents of rulers who had never had contact with one another. Religious and ideological movements across Terra started echoing similar themes: the necessity of human cooperation, the rejection of mutation and deviation, the imperative to reclaim humanity's lost greatness among the stars. These movements arose independently across different continents and cultures, yet their core messages showed remarkable consistency. Imperial scholars studying these pre-unification religious texts have identified linguistic and conceptual patterns that suggest common authorship or, at minimum, coordination by a single organizing intelligence. Environmental monitoring stations from this period, the few that survived the wars to come, recorded increasingly frequent seismic disturbances in the Himalayzian mountain ranges. These disturbances followed patterns consistent with massive subterranean construction projects, though no surface evidence of such projects was apparent to contemporary observers. Deep core geological surveys conducted during the early Imperial period revealed extensive underground facilities in these regions, though their construction date could only be estimated as extremely ancient by Imperial standards. As the 30th millennium dawned, the stage was set for transformation on a scale that Terra had not witnessed since the height of the Dark Age of technology. The scattered kingdoms that had been carefully cultivated and prepared over centuries of hidden guidance were about to discover their true purpose, though few would survive the revelation intact. The acceleration of change in the final decades before unification suggests that whatever intelligence had been orchestrating Terra's selective recovery was preparing for a decisive phase of its plan. Resources were being concentrated, technologies were being refined, and populations were being psychologically prepared for changes that would reshape not merely their world, but their species itself. The first authenticated appearance of the Emperor of Mankind as a public figure occurred in the mountain territories north of the former Himalayan ranges, in a region that would later house the foundations of the Imperial Palace itself. The event, recorded in fragmentary accounts from multiple kingdoms, defied explanation by any contemporary understanding of human capability. Witnesses described a figure of impossible presence who appeared before the assembled warlords of 3 different kingdoms simultaneously, a feat that suggested either unprecedented mastery of holographic projection or capabilities that transcended normal physical limitations entirely. The diplomatic overtures that followed this initial manifestation established patterns that would define the Emperor's approach throughout the Unification Wars. Unlike the crude ultimatums typical of techno-barbarian warfare, his proposals were comprehensive political and technological frameworks that addressed the fundamental challenges facing human civilization on Terra. He offered not merely protection or alliance, but transformation, the systematic reconstruction of human society along lines that would eliminate the weaknesses that had led to the Age of Strife while enhancing the capabilities that would carry humanity to greatness among the stars. The first kingdom to experience direct Imperial intervention was the Caucasian Techno-Collective, a loose confederation of fortress cities that controlled strategic passages through the irradiated mountain ranges. Their rulers, hardened by centuries of warfare against mutant raiders and rival kingdoms, initially approached the Emperor's representatives with the cynicism that had kept them alive in Terra's hostile environment. What they encountered instead was a demonstration of power that rendered their skepticism irrelevant. Contemporary accounts describe energy discharges that illuminated the night sky for hundreds of kilometers, followed by the systematic disabling of the collective's defensive systems without apparent hostile action. Their most advanced weapons simply ceased to function. Their communication networks became conduits for transmissions from the Emperor's forces. Their fortress walls, built to withstand atomic bombardment, became transparent to sensors that revealed the exact location and disposition of every defender. Yet rather than pressing his obvious advantage through conquest, the Emperor chose revelation over domination, a decision that would prove far more effective than any military campaign. The transformation of the Caucasian techno-collective into the first willing imperial territory required less than 72 hours. The speed of this conversion cannot be attributed solely to the demonstrated superiority of imperial technology. Detailed analysis of survivor testimonies reveals that the Emperor's representatives possessed not merely superior weapons but superior knowledge, comprehensive understanding of the collective's history, leadership structure, resource limitations, and strategic vulnerabilities that could only have been gathered through decades of careful observation. More significantly, the Imperial forces offered immediate solutions to problems that had plagued the collective for generations. Their genetic researchers provided treatments for the accumulated mutations that had been slowly killing the population. Their engineers implemented atmospheric processing systems that created zones of breathable air throughout the territory. Their agricultural specialists introduced techniques that could produce viable crops in contaminated soil. Within days, the quality of life for ordinary citizens improved more dramatically than it had in centuries. Word of these transformations spread across Terra's communication networks with unprecedented speed. The primitive data transmission systems that had connected certain kingdoms during the late Age of Strife suddenly carried detailed reports of Imperial capabilities and offers. The consistency of these reports, despite originating from dozens of independent sources, suggests that the Emperor's forces had gained access to and influence over Terra's entire communication infrastructure long before their public emergence. The reaction among Terra's remaining kingdoms varied dramatically according to their relative strength and strategic position. The most powerful warlords, confident in their ability to resist any conventional threat, initially dismissed imperial expansion as a temporary phenomenon that would collapse under the weight of Terra's harsh realities. The weaker kingdoms, struggling for survival against environmental catastrophe and military pressure, began reaching out to imperial representatives with offers of immediate submission. The Emperor's response to these varied reactions revealed the sophistication of his strategic planning. Rather than accepting all offers of submission or attempting to conquer all sources of resistance simultaneously, Imperial forces began a carefully orchestrated campaign of selective engagement designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing resource expenditure. Kingdoms that offered valuable technological or genetic resources were incorporated immediately. Those that controlled strategic territory were offered generous terms for voluntary integration. The most powerful potential opponents were isolated diplomatically while being subjected to demonstrations of imperial capability that made resistance seem futile. But it was the emergence of the Emperor's enhanced warriors that truly changed the strategic balance of power on Terra. For these beings represented capabilities that transcended the normal limitations of human physiology and psychology. The first confirmed sighting of what would later be identified as Thunder Warriors occurred during the integration of the Frank territories, when Imperial forces encountered resistance from a coalition of kingdoms that had banded together in opposition to unification. The battle, which military historians would later study as a perfect example of post-human warfare, demonstrated capabilities that shattered contemporary understanding of combat effectiveness. Warriors who could survive direct hits from energy weapons, who could leap across distances that would cripple normal humans, who could process tactical information and react to threats with superhuman speed and precision. Yet even more impressive than their physical capabilities was their psychological impact on both enemies and potential allies. These warriors fought with a discipline and coordination that surpassed anything in the experience of Terra's military leaders. They showed no fear of death, no hesitation in the face of overwhelming odds, no mercy for those who opposed them, but also no unnecessary cruelty toward those who surrendered. They were, in every observable way, perfected human soldiers. The integration of the Frank territories established the template that imperial expansion would follow throughout the Unification Wars. Military resistance was crushed with overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Civilian populations were immediately provided with medical care, environmental protection, and technological upgrades that improved their living conditions dramatically. Local leaders who submitted willingly were incorporated into the expanding imperial administrative structure with positions of real authority and responsibility. Those who resisted were eliminated, but their followers were offered full integration into imperial society without prejudice or punishment. This combination of irresistible military power and genuine improvement in living conditions proved devastatingly effective. Within months of the Frank integration, dozens of kingdoms across Terra were actively seeking imperial incorporation. The process of unification had transformed from conquest to competition, with the competition focused on demonstrating worthiness for imperial attention rather than resistance to imperial expansion. The acceleration of voluntary submissions created logistical challenges that revealed another aspect of imperial preparation. The administrative systems, genetic treatment facilities, technological manufacturing capacity, and enhanced warrior production capabilities necessary to integrate dozens of kingdoms simultaneously could not have been improvised. Evidence suggests that the emperor had been preparing for this phase of expansion for decades, possibly centuries, with hidden facilities and stockpiled resources distributed across Terra in anticipation of rapid territorial growth. As the second year of public imperial activity began, more than half of Terra's surviving kingdoms had either been integrated or were actively negotiating for integration, and the remainder faced the growing realization that resistance was becoming not merely futile, but counterproductive to their own survival. The momentum of unification had become self-sustaining, driven not by imperial conquest, but by the recognition among Terra's survivors that the emperor offered what no other leader in recorded history had provided: a credible path forward from the ashes of the Age of Strife to a future that might reclaim humanity's lost greatness. Yet even as this recognition spread, few could have imagined the true scope of the transformation that awaited them, or the price that would eventually be demanded for humanity's ascension to the stars. The systematic documentation of Thunder Warriors in combat began with the siege of Millennia, a fortress city that had dominated the trade routes through the Ursh territories for over 2 millennia. Built into the bones of a pre-Age of Strife archaeology, Millennia represented the pinnacle of techno-barbarian defensive engineering. Its walls incorporated energy shielding technology that could deflect orbital bombardment, while its weapon systems commanded approaches across hundreds of square kilometers of irradiated wasteland. The fortress had never fallen to assault in its recorded history, and its defenders had grown confident that their combination of advanced technology and strategic position made them effectively invulnerable. The Thunder Warriors who appeared before Millennia's gates challenged every assumption about human limitation that had governed warfare since the collapse of the Dark Age of technology. Imperial records from the siege, compiled from multiple observer accounts and defensive sensor logs, described superhuman beings whose capabilities seemed to violate fundamental principles of biology and physics. Warriors standing nearly 3 meters tall, encased in powered armor that integrated seamlessly with their enhanced physiology, wielding weapons that channeled energies previously thought controllable only by vehicle-mounted systems. The initial assault demonstrated capabilities that transcended normal tactical doctrine. Thunder Warriors leaped across defensive barriers that had been designed to stop armored vehicles, their enhanced musculature allowing them to clear obstacles 40 meters high while carrying full combat loads. Energy weapons that could vaporize normal humans merely staggered these enhanced soldiers, who continued fighting through injuries that would have killed dozens of ordinary warriors. Most remarkably, they demonstrated reaction speeds that allowed them to track and engage multiple aerial targets simultaneously while maintaining coordinated ground operations. But it was their psychological impact that proved most devastating to Millennia's defenders. Techno-barbarian warriors, hardened by generations of warfare in Terra's hostile environment, found themselves facing opponents who seemed immune to fear, pain, or fatigue. The Thunder Warriors fought with mechanical precision, adapting their tactics in real time to counter defensive measures that had been developed over centuries of siege warfare. They showed no hesitation when advancing through killing fields that should have been impassable. No confusion when their formations were disrupted by defensive fire. No mercy when they reached close quarters with their opponents. Yet the most disturbing aspect of their performance was not their individual capabilities, but their perfect coordination, as if dozens of separate warriors were components of a single vast intelligence directing the battle. The siege of Malin Sen lasted 17 days, during which the fortress's defenders witnessed the systematic demonstration of Imperial military doctrine, rather than relying on overwhelming firepower or massive numerical superiority. The Thunder Warriors employed precision and adaptation to neutralize specific defensive systems, while preserving the infrastructure they intended to capture. Each day brought new revelations of their capabilities: infiltration through barriers thought impenetrable, sabotage of systems believed immune to external interference, tactical innovations that exploited weaknesses the defenders had never recognized. The fortress fell not through the collapse of its walls, or the failure of its weapons, but through the psychological breakdown of its defenders. By the siege's final days, entire sections of the garrison were surrendering rather than face direct combat with the Thunder Warriors. Sensor logs from the fortress's command center record the moment when the last pocket of resistance ceased fighting, not because they had been overwhelmed, but because they had witnessed capabilities that made continued resistance seem not merely futile, but irrelevant to the outcome. Word of Malin Sen's fall spread across Terra's communication networks with unprecedented speed and detail. For the first time, the scattered kingdoms of Terra possessed comprehensive documentation of Imperial military capabilities, and the implications were inescapable. The Thunder Warriors represented a qualitative advancement in human warfare that rendered traditional military doctrine obsolete. No fortress could hold against opponents who could breach any barrier. No defensive system could stop soldiers who could adapt to any countermeasure. No tactical advantage could overcome warriors who fought with perfect coordination and superhuman capabilities. The reaction among Terra's remaining independent kingdoms varied according to their military strength and strategic position, but the underlying pattern was consistent: recognition that resistance to imperial expansion had become an exercise in self-destruction. The kingdoms with the most advanced military capabilities began reaching out to imperial representatives, not to negotiate terms of surrender, but to explore possibilities for voluntary integration that might preserve their technological assets and leadership structures. This shift from resistance to negotiation marked a fundamental transformation in the nature of imperial expansion, as conquest gave way to voluntary submission driven by recognition of inevitable outcomes. The integration of the Ursh territories following Malin Sen's fall established protocols that would govern imperial expansion throughout the Unification Wars. Thunder Warriors were deployed not as occupying forces but as demonstration units whose presence eliminated the possibility of organized resistance, while imperial administrators worked to integrate local populations into the expanding imperial structure. The combination of overwhelming military superiority and immediate improvement in living conditions proved irresistible to populations that had endured centuries of warfare and environmental catastrophe. The technological integration process revealed another aspect of imperial preparation that contemporary observers found deeply unsettling. Imperial forces possessed detailed knowledge of every significant technological system in use across Terra's kingdoms, including classified defensive measures and experimental weapons programs that had been kept secret for decades. This intelligence advantage allowed them to identify and neutralize potential threats before they could be deployed, while simultaneously identifying valuable technologies that could be incorporated into imperial capabilities. The genetic enhancement of local populations began immediately upon imperial integration, using techniques that represented dramatic advances over anything available to the techno-barbarian kingdoms. Radiation damage that had accumulated over generations was reversed within months. Genetic mutations that had been gradually killing entire bloodlines were corrected using therapies that seemed to operate at the cellular level. Most remarkably, the enhanced physical and mental capabilities that had been restricted to ruling elites in the techno-barbarian kingdoms were made available to entire populations through imperial enhancement programs. The Thunder Warriors themselves became objects of intense fascination and study among newly integrated populations. Unlike the crude genetic modifications employed by techno-barbarian rulers, the enhancements that created these superhuman soldiers appeared to be comprehensive transformations that affected every aspect of their physiology and psychology. They required minimal sustenance, showed no signs of aging or fatigue, and demonstrated learning capabilities that allowed them to master new technologies and tactics with superhuman speed. Yet even as admiration for Thunder Warrior capabilities spread throughout Imperial territories, careful observers began noting subtle anomalies in their behavior and performance. Medical examinations of injured Thunder Warriors revealed physiological stress patterns that suggested their enhancements came with hidden costs. Psychological evaluations indicated emotional responses that differed from normal human patterns in ways that were not immediately apparent but became more noticeable with extended observation. These early warning signs would later be recognized as symptoms of the genetic instability that would ultimately doom the Thunder Warriors, but at the time they were dismissed as acceptable costs for superhuman capability. The establishment of Thunder Warrior recruitment and training facilities across newly integrated territories marked the beginning of Imperial military expansion on a scale that dwarfed anything in Terra's recorded history. Rather than relying on existing populations for military service, Imperial forces began implementing genetic screening and enhancement programs designed to identify and transform suitable candidates into superhuman soldiers. The scale of these operations suggested preparation for conflicts that would extend far beyond Terra's boundaries. The reaction of Terra's remaining independent kingdoms to these developments revealed the growing realization that Imperial expansion represented not merely political conquest, but species-level transformation. The Emperor was not simply uniting Terra's scattered populations under a single government. He was systematically remaking humanity itself according to a vision that transcended anything in recorded history. The choice facing Terra's survivors was not between independence and submission, but between transformation and extinction. In the territories that had submitted to Imperial rule during the early phases of unification, the third decade of the 30th millennium witnessed transformations that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of Imperial planners. The combination of advanced technology, genetic enhancement, and unified administration had produced improvements in human civilization that surpassed anything achieved since the legendary heights of the Dark Age of technology. Cities rose from radioactive wasteland within years rather than centuries. Populations that had been slowly dying from accumulated genetic damage were restored to full health and enhanced beyond normal human limitations. Most remarkably, the industrial capacity to produce advanced technology was expanding at rates that suggested Terra might soon exceed its pre-Age of Strife capabilities. The genetic enhancement programs that had begun as medical treatments for radiation damage and inherited mutations evolved into comprehensive transformation protocols that redefined human potential itself. Imperial gene crafters, working with technologies that seemed to operate at the quantum level of DNA manipulation, had developed techniques that could not merely repair damaged genetic structures, but optimize them for performance beyond anything achieved through natural evolution. Enhanced humans in Imperial territories demonstrated improved strength, speed, endurance, and cognitive function that made them demonstrably superior to their unmodified cousins in every measurable category. The Thunder Warriors represented the pinnacle of these enhancement techniques, but they were not unique in their superhuman capabilities. Imperial territories contained growing populations of enhanced civilians whose abilities, while not reaching Thunder Warrior levels, far exceeded normal human limitations. These enhanced populations formed the backbone of Imperial administration, engineering, and manufacturing, creating a civilization where superhuman capability was becoming the baseline rather than the exception. The technological mastery achieved in Imperial territories during this period defied contemporary understanding of scientific possibility. Manufacturing facilities that had taken centuries to construct using traditional techniques were being completed in months using Imperial engineering methods. Energy systems that could power entire cities were being installed using compact reactor designs that seemed to violate known principles of physics. Most remarkably, the genetic laboratories that produced Thunder Warriors and enhanced civilians operated with precision and speed that suggested access to computational resources beyond anything available to techno-barbarian science. Yet even as Imperial territories approached levels of prosperity and capability that seemed almost utopian by the standards of the Age of Strife, subtle flaws in the system were beginning to manifest in ways that would prove prophetic of future disasters. The organizational structure of Imperial military forces had evolved into a hierarchy of enhancement that created clear distinctions between different categories of superhuman soldiers. At the apex stood the Thunder Warriors themselves, whose genetic modifications and psychological conditioning made them perfect instruments of Imperial will. Below them were the enhanced guard units that maintained order in conquered territories, while specialized technical and support personnel provided the infrastructure necessary to maintain superhuman military forces in the field. This hierarchy of enhancement created unprecedented military effectiveness, but it also established dependency relationships that had no precedent in human history. Thunder warriors required specialized equipment, unique nutritional supplements, and ongoing medical support that could only be provided by Imperial facilities. They were not merely superior soldiers, they were engineered organisms whose survival depended on continued access to the technologies that had created them. The resource demands of maintaining superhuman military forces were enormous by any historical standard. The genetic laboratories alone required energy inputs equivalent to powering major cities, while the manufacturing facilities that produced Thunder Warrior equipment consumed raw materials at rates that strained even Terra's recovering industrial capacity. The mathematical projections were becoming inescapable. The current system could be maintained only as long as Imperial expansion continued to provide access to new resources and populations. The psychological conditioning that created Thunder Warrior loyalty and effectiveness was achieving results that exceeded the most optimistic projections of Imperial planners. These superhuman soldiers demonstrated absolute dedication to Imperial goals, perfect coordination in combat operations, and complete immunity to the fear, doubt, and selfish motivations that had limited the effectiveness of normal human armies throughout history. They were, in every measurable way, ideal soldiers. Yet careful analysis of Thunder Warrior psychology revealed patterns that suggested their conditioning might be too perfect for long-term stability. Their emotional responses had been optimized for combat effectiveness at the expense of psychological complexity that provided resilience in other contexts. Their social interactions were functional but limited, creating isolated individuals whose primary relationships were with their military units and their Imperial mission. Most concerning, their capacity for independent thought and moral reasoning appeared to have been constrained in ways that made them dependent on external authority for guidance in complex situations. The genetic instability that would eventually doom the Thunder Warriors was already present in the early specimens, though its symptoms were subtle enough to be dismissed as acceptable variations in the enhancement process. Medical examinations revealed cellular stress patterns that suggested accelerated aging, though the enhanced physical capabilities of Thunder Warriors made this degradation difficult to detect through normal observation. Psychological evaluations indicated emotional volatility that increased with time, though the military discipline of Thunder Warrior culture prevented this instability from manifesting in obvious behavioral problems. The tragic irony was becoming apparent to those with sufficient knowledge to recognize it. The genetic techniques that had created superhuman soldiers were inherently unstable, and the psychological conditioning that made them perfect warriors was simultaneously making them incapable of surviving in any other context. The expansion of Imperial territory during this period required increasingly sophisticated administrative systems to manage populations and resources across vast geographic areas. The enhanced humans who formed Imperial bureaucracy were demonstrating capabilities that allowed them to process information and coordinate activities on scales that had been impossible during the Age of Strife. Communication networks, supply chains, and manufacturing systems were being integrated into unified networks that operated with efficiency approaching theoretical limits. But this administrative sophistication created new vulnerabilities, even as it solved old problems. The enhanced humans who managed Imperial systems were themselves dependent on genetic treatments and technological support that could only be provided by specialized facilities. The communication networks that enabled efficient coordination could also propagate system failures across entire regions with unprecedented speed. Most dangerously, the centralized decision-making that enabled rapid responses to challenges also created single points of failure that could paralyze entire systems if compromised. The industrial capacity of Imperial territories was approaching levels that would enable expansion beyond Terra itself, with manufacturing systems capable of producing the spacecraft, weapons, and support equipment necessary for interplanetary operations. The enhanced human populations were demonstrating capabilities that would enable them to function effectively in the hostile environments of other worlds. Most importantly, the genetic enhancement techniques that had transformed Terra's survivors were proving adaptable to the challenges of space-based civilization. Yet the resource consumption required to maintain these capabilities was growing at rates that would soon exceed Terra's capacity to provide raw materials, even with the most efficient recycling and conservation measures. The mathematical projections were unambiguous. Imperial civilization in its current form could be sustained only through continued expansion that provided access to the resources of other worlds. The success of unification was creating the imperative for what would later become the Great Crusade. The cultural transformation of imperial territories was producing populations whose worldview and expectations had been fundamentally altered by their experiences of genetic enhancement and technological prosperity. These enhanced humans thought of themselves not merely as Terrans or members of particular kingdoms, but as representatives of a new form of human civilization that was destined to reclaim humanity's place among the stars. Their loyalty to the Emperor was not merely political allegiance, but religious devotion to the being who had made their transformation possible. This cultural transformation would prove essential to the success of imperial expansion, but it was also creating expectations and dependencies that would make any failure of imperial promises catastrophic for both rulers and ruled. As the fourth decade of the 30th millennium began, imperial territories contained approximately 60% of Terra's surviving population, with industrial and military capabilities that exceeded the combined strength of all remaining independent kingdoms. The success of imperial unification had transformed from a theoretical possibility into an inevitable outcome, with remaining resistance serving primarily to delay rather than prevent the completion of Terra's political integration. Yet even as victory appeared certain, the hidden flaws in imperial systems were beginning to manifest in ways that would soon force the emperor to make choices that would define the character of his empire for millennia to come. The philosophy of unity that had emerged from the emperor's early conquests began to take on characteristics that transcended mere political doctrine, evolving instead into a comprehensive worldview that redefined humanity's understanding of its own nature and destiny. In the territories that had been integrated into the expanding imperial domain, populations that had spent generations fighting for mere survival were now being exposed to concepts that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about human limitation and possibility. Unity was not simply the absence of conflict, but the active cooperation of enhanced human capabilities toward goals that individual communities could never have achieved in isolation. The implementation of unity across diverse Terran cultures required unprecedented sophistication in cultural integration and psychological manipulation. The emperor's administrators had developed techniques that could identify and preserve valuable cultural elements while systematically eliminating aspects that conflicted with imperial goals. Religious traditions that emphasized human cooperation and advancement were encouraged and refined, while those that promoted division or acceptance of limitation were gradually replaced with imperial alternatives. Languages were standardized to facilitate communication across vast territories, but local variations were preserved to maintain cultural identity and prevent the homogenization that could lead to resistance. The success of these integration techniques was most dramatically demonstrated in the territories of former Europa, where dozens of kingdoms that had maintained fierce independence for millennia began voluntarily requesting incorporation into imperial administration. The process followed a consistent pattern. Initial contact would establish imperial superiority through demonstration rather than conquest, followed by offers of genetic enhancement and technological improvement that addressed the most pressing concerns of local populations. Within months, communities that had defined themselves through opposition to outside influence were actively competing to demonstrate their loyalty to imperial ideals. The expansion of imperial influence during this period was characterized by acceleration rather than simple territorial growth. Each successful integration provided resources, populations, and technological capabilities that enabled more rapid expansion into adjacent territories. The enhanced human administrators who managed imperial systems demonstrated learning capabilities that allowed them to adapt integration techniques to local conditions with increasing effectiveness. Most importantly, the populations of integrated territories became advocates for imperial expansion, using their enhanced capabilities to convince neighboring communities of the benefits of voluntary submission. Yet even as imperial expansion achieved unprecedented success through voluntary cooperation rather than military conquest, the fundamental contradictions inherent in the unity philosophy were beginning to manifest in ways that would challenge its long-term sustainability. The reaction of Terra's remaining independent kingdoms to imperial expansion revealed the growing recognition that resistance was becoming not merely difficult, but counterproductive to their own survival. The kingdoms with the most sophisticated intelligence networks had begun to understand that imperial integration offered genuine improvements in quality of life that could not be achieved through any alternative means. Their populations were witnessing the transformation of neighboring territories from radioactive wastelands into prosperous communities whose inhabitants demonstrated capabilities that approached the legendary standards of humanity's golden age. The diplomatic initiatives launched during this period represented a fundamental shift in the nature of imperial expansion. Rather than simply offering terms for surrender, imperial representatives began presenting comprehensive development plans that addressed the specific challenges facing each kingdom. These plans demonstrated detailed knowledge of local conditions, resources, and population characteristics that could only have been gathered through decades of careful observation. More remarkably, they offered solutions to problems that local rulers had considered insoluble, using technologies and techniques that seemed to operate according to principles beyond contemporary scientific understanding. The cultural assimilation policies implemented in newly integrated territories achieved results that exceeded the most optimistic projections of imperial planners. Rather than imposing uniform imperial culture, these policies identified and enhanced local traditions that aligned with imperial values while gradually replacing those that created conflict or limitation. The enhanced human populations that emerged from this process retained their cultural identities while gaining capabilities and perspectives that made them natural advocates for further imperial expansion. The technological integration of conquered territories was revealing the true scope of imperial preparation and capability. Advanced manufacturing systems were being installed at speeds that suggested they had been prefabricated and stockpiled in anticipation of rapid expansion. Communication networks were being established using technologies that exceeded anything available to techno-barbarian science. Most significantly, the genetic enhancement facilities that transformed local populations were being constructed using standardized designs that indicated comprehensive advance planning for exactly this type of expansion. The resource management systems that supported imperial expansion were demonstrating efficiency levels that defied contemporary understanding of logistical possibility. Raw materials were being extracted, processed, and distributed across vast territories using integrated networks that minimized waste and maximized productivity. Enhanced human administrators were coordinating these operations with precision that approached the theoretical limits of information processing and decision-making. The result was an economic system that could support unprecedented population growth and technological advancement, while maintaining stability across diverse geographic and cultural regions. But the very efficiency of these systems was creating dependencies that would make any interruption in imperial expansion potentially catastrophic for both the territories that had been integrated and the populations that had been enhanced. The military implications of successful territorial integration were becoming apparent as imperial forces gained access to recruitment populations and industrial resources on scales that had not been available since the Dark Age of technology. The Thunder Warriors, who had initially been deployed in small units for specific operations, were being organized into larger formations capable of conducting major campaigns against the most sophisticated opposition. More significantly, the enhanced human populations of integrated territories were providing support personnel and specialized capabilities that multiplied the effectiveness of superhuman military forces. The psychological impact of imperial expansion on both integrated and independent populations was creating momentum that appeared to be self-sustaining. Communities that had been integrated were demonstrating capabilities and prosperity that made imperial rule appear not merely preferable to independence, but essential for survival in Terra's recovering but still hostile environment. The enhanced humans who administered imperial territories were living examples of human potential realized through imperial techniques, while the Thunder Warriors represented the pinnacle of what enhanced humanity could achieve in military terms. The establishment of educational systems in imperial territories was producing populations whose knowledge and capabilities exceeded those of their predecessors by orders of magnitude. Enhanced humans were demonstrating learning speeds that allowed them to master complex technologies and administrative techniques within months rather than years. More importantly, they were developing philosophical perspectives that emphasized cooperation, advancement, and expansion beyond Terra as natural and necessary goals for human civilization. The communication networks that connected imperial territories were enabling coordination and information sharing on scales that had been impossible during the Age of Strife. Enhanced human administrators could respond to challenges and opportunities across vast distances with reaction times that approached real-time decision-making. These networks were also facilitating cultural exchange and technological advancement that was accelerating the pace of imperial development beyond anything that could have been achieved through isolated territorial expansion. Yet the growing sophistication and integration of imperial systems was also creating vulnerabilities that had no precedent in human history, as the success of the entire imperial project was becoming dependent on the continued effectiveness of technologies and techniques whose long-term stability remained unproven. The agricultural and environmental restoration projects that had transformed imperial territories from radioactive wastelands into productive regions were demonstrating that the damage of the Age of Strife could be reversed using imperial techniques. Atmospheric processors were creating zones of breathable air that were expanding to cover entire continents. Soil treatment programs were eliminating radioactive contamination that had persisted for millennia. Most remarkably, genetic therapy programs were not merely treating the symptoms of environmental damage but restoring human populations to enhanced versions of their pre-Age of Strife capabilities. As the expansion of imperial influence approached the critical threshold where voluntary submission would become more attractive than continued independence for all remaining kingdoms, the fundamental tensions inherent in the unity philosophy were beginning to manifest in ways that would soon force the emperor to confront the contradictions between his ideals and the practical requirements of maintaining the system he had created. The success of imperial expansion was creating challenges that would test the stability of the enhanced human populations, the genetic integrity of the Thunder Warriors, and the philosophical foundations of the imperial project itself. The medical anomalies that began appearing in Thunder Warrior populations during the 5th year of active imperial expansion were initially dismissed as acceptable variations in the enhancement process. Individual warriors reporting unusual fatigue, cellular regeneration delays, and minor psychological disturbances were treated as isolated cases requiring routine medical adjustment, rather than symptoms of systemic problems. The enhanced human medical personnel who staffed imperial facilities had been trained to expect individual variations in genetic enhancement outcomes, and their diagnostic protocols were designed to address specific symptoms rather than identify patterns that might indicate fundamental flaws in the enhancement process itself. The frequency of these medical anomalies increased gradually, following patterns that became apparent only through retrospective analysis of comprehensive medical records. Thunder Warriors, who had been among the first to undergo enhancement, were experiencing cellular breakdown at rates that exceeded theoretical projections by significant margins. Their accelerated healing abilities, which had made them nearly invulnerable in combat situations, were beginning to fail as their enhanced cellular structures proved unable to maintain the energy expenditure required for continuous regeneration. More concerning, the psychological conditioning that had created their perfect discipline and loyalty was showing signs of instability that manifested as unpredictable emotional responses and decision-making difficulties. The attempts to address these problems through medical intervention revealed the true complexity of Thunder Warrior genetic architecture. The enhancement techniques that had created their superhuman capabilities were not simple modifications of normal human genetics, but comprehensive restructuring of biological systems that operated according to principles that pushed the boundaries of scientific understanding. The cellular damage that was becoming apparent could not be treated using conventional medical techniques because it was intrinsic to the enhancement process itself. The same genetic modifications that created superhuman strength and resilience also created metabolic demands that exceeded the long-term capacity of biological systems to sustain. The psychological evaluations that were conducted in response to increasing behavioral anomalies revealed that Thunder Warrior mental conditioning was experiencing deterioration that paralleled their physical decline. The emotional control and strategic thinking capabilities that had made them perfect soldiers were becoming inconsistent as the neurological structures that supported these abilities were affected by the same cellular breakdown that was compromising their physical capabilities. More disturbingly, the social isolation that had been built into their psychological profile was preventing them from seeking help for problems they were experiencing, creating a situation where individual warriors were suffering in silence while the overall pattern remained hidden from Imperial medical personnel. The tragic irony was becoming inescapable. The genetic techniques that had created the Emperor's most effective warriors contained inherent limitations that would ultimately destroy them, and the psychological conditioning that made them loyal and effective was simultaneously preventing them from seeking solutions to their deteriorating condition. The failed attempts to modify existing Thunder Warrior genetics using advanced medical techniques revealed the full scope of the problem facing Imperial forces. The enhancement process that had created superhuman soldiers was not a stable modification of human genetics, but a temporary optimization that achieved extraordinary capability at the cost of long-term viability. The cellular structures that enabled enhanced strength, speed, and endurance were consuming biological resources at rates that could not be sustained indefinitely, while the neurological modifications that created perfect discipline and coordination were creating dependencies that made Thunder Warriors incapable of psychological adaptation to changing circumstances. The resource allocation required to maintain Thunder Warrior forces was increasing at rates that were beginning to strain Imperial logistical capabilities. The specialized nutrition, medical support, and equipment maintenance that enhanced soldiers required was consuming resources that could have supported much larger populations of normal humans or even moderately enhanced personnel. The mathematical projections were becoming undeniable. The current approach to military enhancement was not sustainable for the scale of operations that Imperial expansion would require. The growing awareness of Thunder Warrior limitations was creating strategic planning problems that had no obvious solutions. Imperial military doctrine had been built around the assumption that superhuman soldiers would provide overwhelming superiority over any conceivable opposition. But the recognition that these soldiers had limited operational lifespans was forcing military planners to consider alternatives that had not been necessary during the early phases of expansion. The enhanced human populations that supported Imperial administration were beginning to question the sustainability of military systems that required constant replacement of their most effective personnel. The secrecy surrounding Thunder Warrior medical problems was creating communication difficulties within Imperial command structures. The enhanced human administrators who managed Imperial territories were not being informed about the limitations of their military forces, creating strategic planning based on assumptions that were becoming increasingly unrealistic. The Thunder Warriors themselves were not being told about their medical prognosis, preventing them from making informed decisions about their service and creating psychological stress that was accelerating their deterioration. The environmental factors that were contributing to Thunder Warrior decline were becoming apparent through detailed analysis of deployment patterns and medical outcomes. Warriors who had been exposed to the most extreme combat conditions were experiencing accelerated deterioration, suggesting that the stress of military operations was interacting with genetic instabilities in ways that exceeded the design parameters of their enhancement. The radioactive environment of Terra itself was proving more damaging to enhanced genetic structures than had been anticipated, creating long-term health problems that could not be addressed through routine medical treatment. Yet even as evidence mounted that Thunder Warrior enhancement was fundamentally unsustainable, the strategic advantages they provided were so overwhelming that Imperial expansion had become dependent on their continued effectiveness, creating a situation where military success was simultaneously ensuring the eventual collapse of the military system that made it possible. The industrial capacity required to support Thunder Warrior forces was revealing additional limitations that had not been apparent during the early phases of Imperial expansion. The manufacturing systems that produced specialized equipment and medical supplies for enhanced soldiers were operating at maximum capacity, preventing the expansion of production that would be necessary to support larger military forces. The enhanced human technicians who maintained these systems were reporting equipment failures and resource shortages that suggested the current production model could not be scaled to meet the demands of continued expansion. The genetic research programs that had been initiated to address Thunder Warrior limitations were achieving results that confirmed the fundamental instability of current enhancement techniques, while failing to identify viable solutions. The cellular breakdown that was affecting enhanced soldiers appeared to be intrinsic to the genetic modifications that created their capabilities, making it impossible to address the medical problems without eliminating the superhuman abilities that made them effective. The psychological conditioning that was experiencing deterioration could not be modified without compromising the discipline and loyalty that made Thunder Warriors reliable instruments of Imperial will. The intelligence gathering that was being conducted to identify potential solutions to Thunder Warrior decline was revealing that similar problems had been encountered by some of the most advanced techno-barbarian kingdoms during their own attempts at genetic enhancement. The historical records that survived from these failed experiments provided detailed documentation of the progression from initial success through gradual deterioration to complete system failure. The patterns were remarkably consistent across different enhancement techniques and populations, suggesting that the limitations facing Thunder Warriors were not unique to Imperial methods but represented fundamental constraints on genetic modification technology. The strategic implications of Thunder Warrior decline were forcing Imperial planners to consider alternatives that would fundamentally alter the nature of Imperial military forces and expansion strategies. The development of replacement enhancement techniques would require resources and time that might not be available before current forces became ineffective. The transition to alternative military systems would create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by Terra's remaining independent kingdoms or by threats that had not yet become apparent. Most critically, any change in military capability would require adjustments to Imperial expansion plans that could affect the resource acquisition necessary to support existing enhanced populations. As the recognition of Thunder Warrior instability spread through Imperial command structures, the Emperor was being forced to confront the possibility that his first great success in creating superhuman soldiers might also represent the first great failure of Imperial enhancement technology, with implications that would extend far beyond military effectiveness to challenge the philosophical foundations of the entire Imperial project. The psychological impact of discovering fundamental flaws in the Thunder Warriors was beginning to affect the enhanced human populations that administered Imperial territories. These individuals had been conditioned to view genetic enhancement as the solution to human limitation, and the recognition that even the most advanced enhancement techniques contained inherent instabilities was creating doubt about the long-term viability of Imperial civilization itself. The confidence and optimism that had driven Imperial expansion were being replaced by uncertainty and concern about the sustainability of the system they had committed their lives to supporting. The emergence of coordinated resistance among Terra's remaining independent kingdoms represented a fundamental shift in the nature of opposition to Imperial expansion. Where previous resistance had been characterized by isolated kingdoms fighting desperate defensive actions, the new threat took the form of systematic cooperation between previously hostile territories united by the recognition that Imperial victory would mean the end of human independence forever. The coalition that formed during the 7th year of active expansion included some of Terra's most technologically advanced and militarily capable kingdoms, led by rulers who understood that their only hope for survival lay in presenting unified opposition to Imperial forces before the Emperor's advantages became completely insurmountable. The strategic coordination demonstrated by this anti-Imperial alliance revealed intelligence capabilities that exceeded anything Imperial forces had previously encountered. The coalition kingdoms had somehow gained access to detailed information about Imperial military capabilities, administrative procedures, and technological limitations that should have been impossible for external observers to acquire. Their tactical planning showed sophisticated understanding of Thunder Warrior deployment patterns, enhanced human administrative structures, and the resource requirements that supported Imperial expansion. Most concerning, they appeared to possess knowledge about Thunder Warrior medical problems and genetic instabilities that Imperial command had attempted to keep classified. The military capabilities that the coalition brought to bear against Imperial expansion demonstrated technological advancement that challenged Imperial assumptions about their superiority over techno-barbarian science. Energy weapons that could penetrate Thunder Warrior armor, communication systems that could not be intercepted or jammed by Imperial forces, and defensive technologies that could resist standard Imperial assault techniques had been developed using principles that suggested access to scientific knowledge that exceeded what should have been available to kingdoms that had been isolated during the Age of Strife. The first major confrontation between Imperial forces and the coalition occurred during the attempted integration of the Terra clan territories. When Thunder Warriors encountered organized resistance that employed tactics specifically designed to exploit their genetic vulnerabilities, coalition forces used chemical weapons that accelerated cellular breakdown and enhanced soldiers, deployed sonic weapons that disrupted the neurological conditioning that maintained Thunder Warrior discipline, and implemented strategic approaches that forced prolonged engagements designed to exhaust the metabolic resources that superhuman soldiers required for sustained operations. The tactical sophistication of coalition resistance revealed that Imperial expansion was no longer facing desperate kingdoms fighting for survival, but organized opposition that possessed both the knowledge and capability to challenge Imperial military superiority through scientific rather than numerical advantages. The escalation of conflict that followed the Terra engagement demonstrated the coalition's commitment to total resistance rather than negotiated settlement. Unlike previous opposition, which had been willing to accept defeat when faced with overwhelming Imperial advantages, the coalition kingdoms showed determination to continue fighting regardless of casualties or resource costs. Their propaganda networks spread messages that characterized Imperial expansion as genocide rather than unification, claiming that genetic enhancement was a form of slavery that eliminated human free will and individual identity. The deployment of increasingly desperate weapons by coalition forces marked a turning point in the character of the Unification Wars. Archaeological evidence suggests that some coalition kingdoms began activating defense systems that had been dormant since the Dark Age of technology, using automated weapons platforms and environmental manipulation techniques that threatened to destabilize Terra's recovering ecosystem. Energy discharges detected by Imperial monitoring systems indicated that coalition forces were experimenting with weapons that could cause planetary-scale environmental damage in their determination to prevent Imperial victory. The psychological warfare employed by the coalition proved particularly effective against Imperial-enhanced human populations. Propaganda broadcasts that reached deep into Imperial territories spread detailed information about Thunder Warrior medical problems, genetic instability in enhanced humans, and the resource costs of maintaining Imperial enhancement programs. These messages were crafted to exploit the growing concerns that enhanced human administrators were experiencing about the sustainability of Imperial systems, creating doubt and anxiety that began to affect the efficiency of Imperial governance. The intelligence warfare that accompanied military escalation revealed that the coalition had developed capabilities that threatened the security of Imperial communication and command systems. Imperial forces began experiencing communication failures, data corruption, and command structure disruptions that suggested enemy infiltration of their most secure networks. Enhanced human administrators reported receiving conflicting orders, accessing corrupted databases, and experiencing system failures that could not be explained by technical problems or normal operational stress. The resource warfare that coalition forces implemented against Imperial expansion created logistical challenges that strained Imperial supply systems beyond their design limits. Coalition attacks targeted Imperial manufacturing facilities, genetic enhancement centers, and resource extraction operations, using techniques that maximized economic damage while minimizing direct military confrontation. The cumulative effect was to force Imperial forces to divert increasing resources to defensive operations, while reducing the industrial capacity that supported continued expansion. The coalition's strategic approach revealed understanding that Imperial expansion was dependent on continued success, and that forcing Imperial forces into defensive operations while reducing their resource base could create a cascading collapse that would end Imperial expansion without requiring direct military victory over Thunder Warrior forces. The environmental warfare that coalition forces employed against Imperial territories represented the most dangerous escalation in the conflict's progression. Ancient orbital defense platforms were activated to conduct bombardments of Imperial industrial facilities, while atmospheric manipulation systems were used to create toxic storm fronts that forced Imperial populations into emergency shelters. Most dangerously, some coalition kingdoms began experimenting with biological weapons designed to target the genetic modifications that created Imperial-enhanced humans. The psychological impact of coalition resistance on Thunder Warrior forces was becoming apparent through increasing incidents of behavioral instability and tactical errors that had no precedent in previous Imperial military operations. Warriors who had demonstrated perfect discipline and coordination were beginning to show signs of stress, uncertainty, and emotional volatility that compromised their effectiveness in complex operational environments. Medical examinations revealed that the psychological pressure of facing organized resistance was interacting with their existing genetic instabilities in ways that accelerated their deterioration. The strategic implications of coalition resistance were forcing Imperial planners to consider alternatives that would fundamentally alter their approach to territorial expansion. The resource costs of fighting sustained campaigns against organized opposition were approaching levels that would prevent the continued expansion necessary to support existing Imperial populations. The Thunder Warrior casualties that resulted from prolonged combat operations were reducing Imperial military capabilities faster than replacement forces could be produced. Most critically, the growing awareness of Imperial vulnerabilities was encouraging additional kingdoms to join the coalition rather than seek voluntary integration. The technological advancement that coalition forces demonstrated during major engagements suggested that their access to advanced scientific knowledge was not limited to defensive applications. Imperial intelligence reports documented coalition experiments with genetic enhancement techniques that appeared to be designed to create their own superhuman soldiers, using principles that might avoid the instabilities that were affecting Thunder Warriors. The possibility that coalition forces might achieve genetic enhancement capabilities without Imperial limitations represented a strategic threat that could permanently alter the balance of power on Terra. The diplomatic initiatives that the coalition launched during this period revealed their strategy of presenting Imperial expansion as a threat to human diversity and freedom, rather than simply territorial conquest. Coalition propaganda emphasized the cultural homogenization that followed Imperial integration, the dependency relationships that genetic enhancement created, and the loss of individual autonomy that resulted from Imperial psychological conditioning. These messages were designed to appeal to populations in Imperial territories who might be experiencing doubts about the costs of their enhanced status. As the coalition's resistance continued to escalate and their capabilities continued to expand, Imperial forces were facing the recognition that their technological and military advantages were not sufficient to guarantee victory against organized opposition that possessed both the knowledge to exploit Imperial weaknesses and the determination to accept any cost to prevent Imperial success. The emergence of coalition capabilities that could threaten Imperial enhanced human populations directly marked the point where the conflict transcended military operations to become a struggle for the survival of Imperial civilization itself. The genetic enhancement techniques that had created Imperial advantages were becoming targets for weapons specifically designed to exploit their vulnerabilities, while the administrative systems that supported Imperial expansion were being disrupted by intelligence operations that threatened the coordination necessary for continued territorial integration. The recognition that conventional military and technological advantages were insufficient to overcome coalition resistance forced Imperial forces to abandon the cautious, methodical approach that had characterized the early phases of unification. The Emperor's directive to accelerate all enhancement programs regardless of safety protocols marked the beginning of the most dangerous period in Imperial genetic research, as the hidden laboratories beneath the Himalayzian Mountains began conducting experiments that pushed the boundaries of scientific knowledge into territories that would have been considered recklessly dangerous during more stable circumstances. The genetic modification programs that had created the Thunder Warriors were expanded and intensified, using techniques that incorporated elements derived from sources that violated every principle of human genetic purity that had guided Imperial science. Xenobiological material recovered from the depths of Terra's most irradiated regions was integrated into enhancement protocols designed to create warriors whose capabilities would exceed those of existing Thunder Warriors by orders of magnitude. The cellular instabilities that had plagued earlier enhancement attempts were addressed through the incorporation of regenerative mechanisms derived from organisms that had survived Terra's most hostile environments. The experimental enhancement subjects who emerged from these programs demonstrated capabilities that transcended previous understanding of biological limitation. Warriors whose strength exceeded Thunder Warrior norms by significant margins, whose regenerative abilities could repair damage that would have been fatal to earlier enhanced soldiers, whose psychological conditioning appeared immune to the deterioration that was affecting existing forces. Yet these improvements came at costs that became apparent only through extended observation and comprehensive medical analysis. The psychological modifications that accompanied these advanced enhancements created individuals whose relationship to normal human experience had been fundamentally altered. The enhanced warriors produced by experimental programs demonstrated emotional responses that were consistent and predictable but lacked the complexity and adaptability that characterized normal human psychology. Their decision-making processes were optimized for military effectiveness, but showed significant limitations when applied to situations that required creativity, compromise, or independent moral reasoning. The terrible irony of these innovations was becoming apparent to the scientists who created them. Each advancement in genetic enhancement capability was simultaneously an advancement in the elimination of essential human characteristics, creating warriors who were increasingly effective as weapons but decreasingly viable as human beings. The resource demands of experimental enhancement programs were consuming Imperial manufacturing and energy capacity at rates that threatened the sustainability of existing Imperial operations. The genetic laboratories required inputs of rare materials, exotic energy sources, and specialized equipment that could not be produced using standard Imperial manufacturing techniques. The enhanced warriors produced by these programs required support systems that were even more complex and resource-intensive than those needed for Thunder Warriors, creating logistical demands that strained Imperial supply networks beyond their design limits. The unintended consequences of experimental genetic modification began manifesting within months of the first enhanced warriors entering active service. Cellular breakdown occurred at accelerated rates compared to Thunder Warriors, while psychological instability appeared earlier and progressed more rapidly than had been observed in previous enhancement subjects. Most concerning, the experimental warriors began exhibiting behavioral anomalies that suggested their genetic modifications were affecting brain chemistry in ways that had not been anticipated by Imperial scientists. The integration of xenobiological material into Imperial enhancement programs created genetic structures that were fundamentally unstable in ways that had no precedent in human experience. The regenerative capabilities that had been derived from non-human sources operated according to biological principles that were incompatible with human cellular architecture, creating enhancement subjects whose bodies were simultaneously healing and destroying themselves at the molecular level. The long-term effects of these modifications could not be predicted using any available scientific models. The deployment of experimental warriors in combat operations revealed capabilities that exceeded all previous Imperial military standards, while simultaneously demonstrating vulnerabilities that made them unsuitable for sustained military operations. Individual warriors could eliminate entire enemy formations through personal combat, but their psychological instability made them unreliable in complex tactical situations. Their enhanced regenerative abilities allowed them to survive injuries that would destroy normal enhanced soldiers, but their accelerated metabolic demands made them dependent on constant resource replenishment that was difficult to provide in field conditions. The point of no return in Imperial enhancement research occurred when experimental programs began incorporating elements that had been recovered from the deepest levels of Terra's most ancient ruins. Archaeological evidence suggests that these materials represented technologies from the Dark Age of technology that had been considered too dangerous for practical application even during humanity's previous Golden Age. The integration of these elements into genetic enhancement protocols created warriors whose capabilities approached the theoretical limits of biological enhancement while simultaneously making them dependent on technologies that Imperial science could barely understand, much less reproduce reliably. The moment when Imperial scientists crossed the threshold from enhancement to transformation marked the beginning of a new phase in human evolution, but it also marked the end of any possibility that the enhanced warriors they were creating could be considered fully human in any meaningful sense. The development of what would later be recognized as the prototype Astartes genetic template occurred during this period of experimental desperation, as Imperial geneticists began designing enhancement protocols that would avoid the instabilities that had plagued Thunder Warrior enhancement while achieving even greater levels of superhuman capability. The early versions of these protocols incorporated lessons learned from Thunder Warrior failures, xenobiological research, and Dark Age technology recovery to create genetic architectures that appeared to offer sustainable superhuman enhancement without the cellular breakdown that had limited earlier enhancement attempts. The resource allocation toward prototype Astartes development required the diversion of materials and personnel from Thunder Warrior support programs, creating a situation where existing Imperial forces were receiving reduced medical support and equipment maintenance while their replacements were being developed in secret facilities. The ethical implications of this decision were recognized by Imperial administrators, but the strategic necessity of developing sustainable enhancement techniques was deemed to outweigh the moral costs of allowing existing warriors to suffer from reduced support. The psychological conditioning protocols that were developed for prototype Astartes incorporated elements designed to address the loyalty and stability problems that had affected experimental warriors. Rather than optimizing for perfect discipline at the cost of psychological complexity, the new protocols attempted to create enhanced soldiers whose emotional and intellectual capabilities would remain functional in diverse operational environments while maintaining absolute loyalty to Imperial authority. The secrecy surrounding prototype Astartes development created communication and coordination problems within Imperial command structures that were becoming increasingly serious as military operations required resources and personnel that were being diverted to classified research programs. Thunder Warrior commanders were not informed about the development of their replacements, creating strategic planning based on assumptions about continued support that were becoming increasingly unrealistic. The realization that Thunder Warrior replacement was not merely desirable but inevitable marked the point where Imperial leadership began planning for the systematic elimination of existing enhanced warriors. The logistical impossibility of maintaining both Thunder Warriors and their Astartes replacements meant that the transition between enhancement systems would require the elimination of warriors who had served Imperial expansion with absolute loyalty and dedication. The moral implications of this decision would define Imperial character for millennia to come. The terrible calculus that drove this decision was inescapable. Imperial expansion required sustainable superhuman military forces, but the resource limitations of Terra meant that maintaining two different enhancement systems was impossible, making the betrayal of loyal servants a practical necessity for the survival of Imperial civilization. The technological integration required to transition from Thunder Warrior to Astartes enhancement systems was revealing the full scope of Imperial preparation and capability. Manufacturing systems for new equipment and support infrastructure were being constructed using standardized designs that suggested the replacement program had been planned far in advance of its implementation. The genetic facilities required to produce Astartes were being established using resources that had been stockpiled in secret locations throughout Imperial territory. The psychological preparation of Imperial personnel for the elimination of Thunder Warriors began with carefully crafted propaganda that emphasized the temporary nature of existing enhancement techniques and the necessity of advancement to more effective military systems. Enhanced human administrators were gradually introduced to the concept that individual sacrifice for Imperial goals was not merely acceptable but essential for the survival of human civilization. As the experimental enhancement programs reached their conclusions, and the prototype Astartes development approached operational status, Imperial leadership was forced to confront the recognition that the success of their innovations had made the betrayal of their most loyal servants not merely possible but inevitable, setting the stage for events that would establish the moral foundations of Imperial rule for the remainder of human history. The decision to eliminate the Thunder Warriors was not reached through a single moment of moral compromise, but through a gradual process of rationalization that transformed loyal servants into acceptable casualties in the name of Imperial necessity. The Emperor's inner circle, consisting of enhanced human administrators and the earliest custodian guard prototypes, began meeting in secret chambers beneath the Imperial Palace to discuss what they euphemistically termed the transition protocols. These discussions, recorded in fragmentary archives that would later be classified at the highest levels of Imperial security, reveal the systematic dehumanization of warriors who had dedicated their enhanced lives to Imperial service. The psychological architecture that enabled Imperial leadership to plan genocide against their own forces was built upon the same philosophical foundations that had justified genetic enhancement and territorial conquest. If individual human lives could be sacrificed for the greater good of unification, and if genetic modification could be imposed to create superhuman capabilities for Imperial benefit, then the elimination of obsolete enhanced humans was simply another necessary step in humanity's advancement toward its destined greatness among the stars. The Thunder Warriors had served their purpose in establishing Imperial dominance over Terra, but their continued existence was incompatible with the resource requirements and strategic objectives of the Astartes program. The involvement of the earliest custodian guard in planning the Thunder Warriors' elimination established precedents for Imperial ruthlessness that would define the relationship between the Emperor and his servants for millennia to come. These enhanced beings, created specifically to serve as the Emperor's personal guard and executioners, demonstrated absolute loyalty to Imperial objectives without regard for the moral implications of their actions. Their psychological conditioning eliminated the capacity for doubt, mercy, or independent moral reasoning that might have prevented them from participating in the systematic murder of loyal Imperial soldiers. The selection criteria used to identify Thunder Warriors for elimination revealed the cold pragmatism that had replaced whatever idealistic motivations had originally driven Imperial expansion. Warriors who had shown signs of genetic instability were marked for immediate termination, while those who had demonstrated questioning or independent thought were classified as security risks requiring elimination. Most tragically, Thunder warriors who had shown exceptional loyalty and effectiveness were also marked for death, as their capabilities and knowledge made them potential threats to Imperial security if they ever discovered the betrayal being planned. The terrible logic of Imperial planning was becoming apparent. The very qualities that had made Thunder warriors valuable servants also made them dangerous witnesses to Imperial methods, creating a situation where loyalty and effectiveness became reasons for elimination rather than preservation. The coordination required to eliminate thousands of enhanced warriors simultaneously revealed the true extent of Imperial administrative capability and moral corruption. Supply chain modifications were implemented to ensure that Thunder warriors would be equipped with weapons and armor that would be inferior to those carried by their Astartes replacements. Medical support protocols were adjusted to ensure that Thunder warrior health problems would be exacerbated rather than treated. Communication systems were modified to prevent Thunder warriors from coordinating with each other once the elimination operation began. The creation of false missions designed to concentrate Thunder warriors in locations where they could be eliminated efficiently demonstrated the systematic nature of Imperial deception. The Thunder warriors were told that they would be participating in the final campaign to eliminate Terra's last independent kingdoms, a mission that would represent the culmination of their service and the achievement of complete unification. The locations selected for these false missions were chosen specifically for their isolation and tactical advantages for the Imperial forces that would conduct the elimination operation. The psychological preparation of Astartes prototypes for their role in eliminating their predecessors required conditioning techniques that went beyond anything previously implemented in Imperial enhancement programs. These new warriors were trained to view Thunder warriors not as fellow Imperial soldiers, but as obsolete weapons that required disposal for the efficiency of Imperial operations. Their psychological architecture was designed to eliminate any capacity for sympathy, doubt, or moral questioning that might interfere with their ability to kill enhanced humans who had served Imperial expansion with absolute dedication. The establishment of historical revisionism protocols even before the elimination operation began revealed Imperial leadership's awareness that their actions represented a fundamental betrayal of Imperial ideals that would require systematic deception to conceal. Official records were prepared that would portray Thunder warrior elimination as a necessary response to rebellion and genetic instability rather than premeditated genocide. Propaganda materials were developed to convince Imperial populations that the Thunder warriors had become dangerous and needed to be eliminated for public safety. The moral corruption that spread through Imperial administrative structures as knowledge of the planned elimination became more widespread demonstrated how institutional evil could transform individuals who had previously maintained ethical standards. Enhanced human administrators who had dedicated their lives to Imperial service began rationalizing mass murder as administrative efficiency. Military planners who had coordinated with Thunder warriors in previous campaigns began viewing them as logistical problems requiring elimination. Medical personnel who had treated Thunder warrior injuries began withholding care to accelerate their deterioration. The normalization of betrayal as Imperial policy was establishing psychological and institutional foundations that would make future genocides, purges, and betrayals seem like natural extensions of Imperial governance rather than moral aberrations requiring justification. The intelligence gathering that preceded the elimination operation revealed that some Thunder warriors were beginning to suspect their fate, creating security concerns that accelerated the timeline for implementing the betrayal. Imperial surveillance networks detected increased communication between Thunder warrior units. Unauthorized medical examinations conducted by warriors seeking to understand their deteriorating condition, and attempts by some warriors to establish independent supply networks that would reduce their dependence on Imperial support systems. The psychological impact of planning genocide on the Emperor himself remains one of the most significant mysteries in Imperial history. Historical records provide no direct evidence of his emotional responses to ordering the elimination of warriors who had served him with absolute loyalty. But indirect evidence suggests that this decision marked a fundamental transformation in his relationship to human morality and individual conscience. The being who had emerged from the Age of Strife promising unity and advancement for all humanity was making choices that prioritized abstract Imperial goals over the lives of specific human beings who had trusted him completely. The establishment of internal security protocols designed to prevent future rebellions or resistance movements demonstrated that Imperial leadership understood the implications of their actions for long-term governance. The betrayal of the Thunder Warriors would establish precedents that would make all future Imperial servants aware that loyalty and service provided no protection against elimination if Imperial objectives required their deaths. The psychological effects of this awareness would fundamentally alter the relationship between Imperial authority and the enhanced humans who administered Imperial territories. The final preparations for the elimination operation included the development of contingency plans for managing the psychological and political aftermath of the betrayal. Imperial propagandists prepared materials that would explain Thunder Warrior elimination as a tragic necessity forced by their genetic instability and psychological deterioration. Administrative personnel were briefed on procedures for managing the resources and territories that had been controlled by Thunder Warrior units. Military planners developed deployment schedules for Astartes forces that would ensure immediate replacement of eliminated Thunder Warriors without interruption in Imperial security or expansion operations. The comprehensive nature of these preparations revealed that the Emperor and his advisors understood that they were not merely eliminating obsolete soldiers, but establishing the fundamental character of Imperial rule for all future generations. A character defined by the willingness to sacrifice any individual or group for the abstract goals of Imperial expansion and efficiency. The moment when final authorization was given for the Thunder Warrior elimination marked the point of no return in Imperial moral development. Whatever idealistic motivations had originally driven the Emperor's emergence from the shadows of the Age of Strife were permanently subordinated to the pragmatic requirements of maintaining and expanding Imperial power. The being who had promised unity and advancement for humanity had become the architect of humanity's first systematic betrayal of its own enhanced children. As the operation moved from planning to implementation, the Emperor was crossing a threshold that would define Imperial character for the remainder of human history, establishing precedents that would make future betrayals, purges, and genocides seem like natural extensions of Imperial policy rather than moral crises requiring justification or remorse. The gradual realization among Thunder Warrior units that their medical problems were not being addressed, but were instead being allowed to deteriorate, created the first cracks in the perfect loyalty that had defined their service to the Imperial cause. Individual warriors who had attempted to seek medical treatment for accelerating genetic breakdown found themselves transferred to remote assignments or placed under observation by Imperial security personnel. Their attempts to communicate with fellow warriors about their deteriorating condition were monitored and increasingly restricted, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and isolation that was completely contrary to the brotherhood and mutual support that had characterized Thunder Warrior culture. The breakdown of communication between Thunder Warrior units and Imperial command structures occurred gradually as false information and conflicting orders began to replace the clear, consistent direction that had previously governed their operations. Warriors who had been accustomed to receiving detailed briefings about their missions and objectives began receiving vague, contradictory instructions that seemed designed to prevent them from understanding the broader strategic situation. Their requests for clarification were ignored or met with responses that suggested their questioning was evidence of psychological instability requiring correction. The fragmentation of Thunder Warrior unity began when some units started sharing information about their medical problems and the inadequate responses they were receiving from Imperial medical personnel. These informal networks revealed that genetic deterioration was affecting all Thunder Warrior forces simultaneously, and that Imperial authorities were not merely failing to address the problem, but were actively concealing its scope from the warriors themselves. The perfect trust that had existed between Thunder Warrior forces and Imperial leadership began to erode as evidence mounted that their condition was being deliberately misrepresented and their needs were being ignored. The emergence of suspicious behavior among Imperial support personnel provided additional evidence that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between Thunder Warriors and the Imperial administration they had served so loyally. Enhanced human technicians who had previously maintained Thunder Warrior equipment with meticulous care began providing inferior maintenance and delaying repairs that could compromise warrior effectiveness in combat situations. Medical personnel who had previously been available for immediate consultation began requiring authorization from higher authorities before providing routine care. The growing awareness among Thunder Warriors that they were being deliberately marginalized and their welfare was being ignored created psychological stress that interacted with their existing genetic instabilities in ways that accelerated their deterioration, while simultaneously making them more difficult to control through normal Imperial administrative procedures. The attempts by some Thunder Warrior commanders to establish independent supply networks and medical support systems represented the first organized resistance to Imperial authority from forces that had previously demonstrated absolute obedience. These efforts were motivated not by rebellion against Imperial goals, but by the recognition that their survival and effectiveness required them to supplement or replace Imperial support systems that were no longer meeting their needs. The psychological transformation required for perfectly loyal soldiers to begin questioning Imperial authority marked a fundamental breakdown in the conditioning that had made them ideal Imperial servants. The intelligence gathering that Imperial security forces conducted to monitor Thunder Warrior activities revealed the extent to which suspicion and doubt were spreading through warrior populations. Surveillance reports documented conversations in which Thunder Warriors speculated about the reasons for their deteriorating treatment, shared information about the mysterious new warriors who were being seen in Imperial facilities, and discussed the possibility that they were being prepared for elimination rather than continued service. The paranoia and uncertainty that characterized these conversations represented a complete reversal of the confidence and trust that had previously defined Thunder Warrior psychology. The moral collapse that occurred among Imperial personnel who were aware of the planned elimination, but were not directly involved in its implementation, demonstrated how institutional evil could corrupt individuals who had not initially intended to participate in betrayal. Enhanced human administrators who had worked closely with Thunder Warriors began treating them with cold professionalism rather than the respect and collaboration that had previously characterized their interactions. Support personnel who had formed personal relationships with individual warriors began avoiding contact that might create emotional complications when the elimination occurred. The systematic failure of Imperial medical support for Thunder Warriors created a crisis of confidence that extended beyond the warriors themselves to affect the enhanced human populations who depended on Imperial medical capabilities for their own survival. If Imperial genetic enhancement could create warriors who were then allowed to deteriorate and die from medical problems that Imperial science could address, what assurance did other enhanced humans have that their own welfare would be protected if it became inconvenient for Imperial objectives? The precedent being established suggested that Imperial loyalty and service provided no protection against abandonment or elimination. The growing recognition among Thunder Warriors that they were being prepared for elimination rather than continued service created desperate attempts to seek alternatives that might preserve their lives and their ability to serve Imperial objectives. Some warriors attempted to establish contact with the coalition forces they had been fighting, hoping to negotiate safe passage or asylum in exchange for intelligence about Imperial capabilities. Others began seeking ways to modify their own genetic structure to address the instabilities that were being used to justify their elimination. The tragic irony of Thunder Warrior desperation was that their enhanced capabilities and perfect loyalty made them ideally suited for Imperial service, but their knowledge of Imperial methods and their potential independence made them unacceptable security risks that required elimination regardless of their value or dedication. The breakdown of supply chain integrity for Thunder Warrior equipment and support represented a systematic effort to ensure that Imperial forces would have overwhelming advantages when the elimination operation began. Weapons that had been maintained in perfect condition began experiencing failures and malfunctions that were not being corrected through normal maintenance procedures. Armor systems that had provided Thunder Warriors with protection equivalent to light vehicles began showing signs of weakness and deterioration that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than normal wear. The psychological preparation of Astartes prototypes for their role in eliminating Thunder Warriors was proceeding according to schedules that indicated the operation was approaching implementation. Intelligence reports from Imperial facilities documented the presence of new enhanced warriors whose capabilities appeared to exceed those of Thunder Warriors while avoiding the genetic instabilities that were affecting existing forces. The recognition that they were being replaced rather than supported created final confirmation for Thunder Warriors that their suspicions about their fate were accurate. The attempted resistance that some Thunder Warrior units began planning represented the last desperate effort to preserve their lives and their service to Imperial objectives. These efforts were hampered by their conditioning against rebellion, their deteriorating physical condition, and their lack of resources or allies outside Imperial systems. The warriors who had been created to be perfect Imperial soldiers found themselves completely unprepared for the possibility that Imperial authority might require their elimination rather than their continued service. The final collapse of Thunder Warrior morale occurred when definitive evidence of the planned elimination became available through intelligence networks that some warriors had managed to establish despite Imperial security measures. The recognition that their loyal service had earned them systematic betrayal rather than continued support created psychological trauma that was incompatible with their conditioning and their understanding of Imperial honor and justice. The point where loyal service became desperate resistance marked not merely the end of Thunder Warrior effectiveness as Imperial soldiers, but the end of the moral authority that had justified Imperial expansion, and the promise of unity and advancement that had motivated Terra's acceptance of Imperial rule. The administrative preparations for managing the aftermath of Thunder Warrior elimination revealed that Imperial leadership understood the full implications of their betrayal for the long-term character of Imperial governance. The precedent being established would make it clear to all future Imperial servants that loyalty and effectiveness provided no protection against elimination. If Imperial objectives required their deaths, fundamentally altering the relationship between Imperial authority and the enhanced humans who would administer the expanding empire. As the final preparations for the elimination operation reached completion, the Emperor was preparing to cross a moral threshold that would define Imperial character for millennia to come. Establishing the principle that individual lives, regardless of their loyalty or service, were expendable resources to be sacrificed for abstract Imperial goals, whenever practical considerations made their elimination convenient or necessary. The selection of Mount Ararat as the site for Thunder Warrior elimination was not arbitrary, but represented a carefully calculated choice that would maximize operational efficiency while providing symbolic justification for what Imperial propaganda would later characterize as a defensive action against rebellious forces. The mountain's isolated location in the former Caucasian territories provided tactical advantages for Imperial forces while preventing Thunder Warriors from receiving support or reinforcement from other Imperial units. More significantly, the site's historical associations with humanity's survival through catastrophic change provided thematic elements that Imperial historians would later use to portray the elimination as necessary adaptation rather than systematic betrayal. The false mission briefings that were used to concentrate Thunder Warriors at Mount Ararat represented the culmination of months of carefully orchestrated deception designed to exploit their loyalty and conditioning against them. The warriors were told that coalition forces had established a fortified position in the mountains using Dark Age technology that posed an existential threat to Imperial expansion, and that their mission was to eliminate this threat through a coordinated assault that would demonstrate the ultimate capabilities of enhanced human soldiers. The mission parameters were designed to appeal to Thunder Warrior psychology by emphasizing honor, duty, and the opportunity to prove their continued value to Imperial objectives. The deployment of Custodian Guard and Proto-Astartes forces to Mount Ararat occurred under strict operational security that prevented Thunder Warriors from recognizing the true nature of the forces that were being positioned against them. The new enhanced warriors were presented as specialized support units that would provide technical assistance and heavy weapon support for the Thunder Warrior assault, when in reality, they were elimination forces equipped with weapons and tactics specifically designed to exploit Thunder Warrior vulnerabilities. The coordination required to position these forces without alerting Thunder Warriors to their true purpose demonstrated the depth of Imperial deception and the systematic nature of the planned betrayal. The initial phase of the Mount Ararat operation proceeded according to Thunder Warrior expectations, with reconnaissance activities and tactical planning that maintained the fiction that they were preparing to assault coalition positions rather than being prepared for elimination themselves. The warriors conducted their standard pre-operation procedures with the disciplined efficiency that had characterized their service throughout the Unification Wars, unaware that their movements were being monitored, and their positions were being recorded for targeting purposes by forces they believed to be their allies. The moment when Thunder Warriors realized they were not facing coalition enemies but Imperial forces marked the point where loyalty and duty were replaced by desperate struggle for survival against betrayal that transcended their ability to comprehend or accept. The revelation of betrayal occurred when Thunder Warriors advancing toward their supposed target positions came under fire from weapons they recognized as Imperial in origin, wielded by enhanced warriors whose capabilities exceeded their own. The psychological shock of this discovery was compounded by the immediate tactical disadvantage they faced, as their equipment had been sabotaged to ensure inferior performance while their opponents possessed superior weapons and armor specifically designed to counter Thunder Warrior capabilities. The perfect coordination and tactical awareness that had made them effective Imperial soldiers became liabilities as they struggled to adapt to combat against opponents who understood their methods and limitations completely. The desperate resistance that Thunder Warriors mounted against their elimination demonstrated the combat capabilities that had made them valuable Imperial assets, even as it confirmed their genetic and psychological deterioration under extreme stress. Individual warriors fought with superhuman determination against overwhelming odds, using tactical innovations and physical capabilities that exceeded their theoretical limits through what appeared to be psychological desperation rather than enhanced physiology. Their resistance was heroic by any measure, but it was also ultimately futile against opponents who possessed superior capabilities and overwhelming numerical and tactical advantages. The participation of the Emperor himself, in the final phases of the elimination operation, remains one of the most controversial aspects of the Mount Ararat massacre. Historical records provide conflicting accounts of his direct involvement, but multiple sources suggest that he personally confronted Thunder Warrior commanders who had realized the true nature of their situation and were attempting to organize coordinated resistance. The psychological impact of discovering that their revered leader was personally directing their elimination created trauma that was visible even in warriors whose conditioning had been designed to eliminate emotional vulnerability. The systematic nature of Thunder Warrior elimination during the final hours of the operation revealed the comprehensive planning that had preceded the betrayal. Every warrior was individually targeted and eliminated using methods that ensured death while minimizing resource expenditure and collateral damage. The precision of the operation demonstrated capabilities that could only have been achieved through detailed intelligence gathering and careful preparation, confirming that the elimination had been planned far in advance rather than being a desperate response to Thunder Warrior rebellion or genetic breakdown. The final communications between Thunder Warriors and Imperial Command during the elimination operation were recorded by Imperial intelligence services and provide the most direct evidence available of the psychological and moral dimensions of the betrayal. Warriors who maintained their loyalty and conditioning even while being eliminated expressed confusion and grief rather than anger or rebellion, asking why their service had been insufficient and what they could have done to avoid their fate. Their final words revealed individuals who had dedicated their enhanced lives to Imperial objectives and could not understand why those objectives now required their deaths. The terrible irony of Thunder Warrior loyalty was that their conditioning prevented them from experiencing the anger and hatred that might have provided psychological protection against the recognition that their perfect service had earned them systematic elimination rather than honor and continued purpose. The tactical effectiveness of Imperial elimination forces during the operation demonstrated capabilities that exceeded Thunder Warrior performance by margins that made resistance futile, regardless of individual heroism or tactical innovation. The Proto-Astartes and Custodian Guard who conducted the elimination showed no signs of hesitation, moral conflict, or psychological stress that might have reduced their effectiveness. Their performance confirmed that Imperial genetic enhancement and psychological conditioning had achieved the creation of soldiers who could eliminate their predecessors without experiencing the loyalty conflicts that might have complicated the operation. The cleanup operations that followed the elimination of the last Thunder Warrior revealed the extent to which Imperial forces had prepared for the complete erasure of evidence that might contradict official accounts of the operation. Bodies were disposed of using methods that prevented identification or forensic analysis, while equipment and personal effects were either destroyed or redistributed to prevent their recognition by surviving Imperial forces. The thoroughness of evidence elimination demonstrated awareness that the betrayal represented actions that could not be justified through normal Imperial policy and required systematic concealment. The immediate psychological impact of the elimination on Imperial forces who witnessed or participated in the operation created the first documented cases of what would later be recognized as moral injury among enhanced human personnel. Some witnesses reported experiencing doubt, guilt, and questioning of Imperial authority that was incompatible with their psychological conditioning. These individuals were subjected to memory modification procedures that represented the first systematic use of psychological manipulation to maintain Imperial loyalty through the suppression of moral awareness, rather than the cultivation of ethical commitment. The establishment of new security protocols in the aftermath of Thunder Warrior elimination revealed Imperial leadership's recognition that the betrayal had established precedents that would require ongoing management to prevent similar resistance or moral questioning among future Imperial forces. Enhanced human personnel were subjected to increased surveillance and psychological evaluation designed to identify potential disloyalty or moral questioning before it could affect their performance or reliability. The completion of Thunder Warrior elimination marked not merely the end of the first generation of Imperial enhanced warriors, but the establishment of Imperial character as fundamentally defined by the willingness to sacrifice any individual or group for abstract organizational objectives, regardless of their loyalty, service, or moral claims on Imperial protection. The final moments of the Mount Ararat operation saw the elimination of Thunder Warriors who had served Imperial expansion with absolute dedication and had earned their fate through loyalty rather than rebellion, establishing the principle that Imperial service provided no protection against elimination when practical considerations made such elimination convenient or necessary for Imperial objectives. The silence that descended over Mount Ararat in the hours following the completion of Thunder Warrior elimination was broken only by the systematic activities of Imperial cleanup crews, whose efficiency in erasing evidence of the massacre demonstrated preparation that had been months in development. The enhanced human personnel who conducted these operations worked with mechanical precision that suggested psychological conditioning designed specifically to enable them to participate in the destruction of evidence without experiencing moral distress or questioning about the necessity of their actions. Their methodical approach to body disposal, equipment destruction, and site sanitization revealed that Imperial leadership had anticipated the need for comprehensive concealment from the earliest stages of planning. The psychological impact on Imperial forces who had witnessed the elimination operation began manifesting within days of the massacre's completion, as enhanced human personnel reported experiencing symptoms that were unprecedented in Imperial medical records. Nightmares, anxiety, depression, and moral questioning appeared in individuals whose genetic and psychological conditioning had been designed to eliminate such vulnerabilities. The medical personnel who treated these symptoms were forced to confront the recognition that Imperial enhancement techniques had not prepared their subjects for the psychological trauma of witnessing systematic betrayal of loyal comrades. The confusion that spread through Imperial territories as Thunder Warrior units failed to return from their missions created administrative challenges that revealed the extent to which Imperial operations had become dependent on enhanced warrior capabilities. Territories that had been controlled by Thunder Warrior forces experienced security gaps that required immediate deployment of Proto-Astartes units whose unfamiliarity with local conditions created temporary instabilities in Imperial governance. The transition demonstrated that eliminating the Thunder Warriors had created operational problems that had not been fully anticipated during the planning phases. The struggle to maintain the deception that Thunder Warriors had been eliminated due to rebellion and genetic instability rather than systematic betrayal required intensive propaganda efforts that revealed Imperial willingness to lie comprehensively to their own populations. Enhanced human administrators were provided with false information about Thunder Warrior elimination that they were expected to disseminate to civilian populations, creating a systematic program of deception that extended throughout Imperial society. The success of this propaganda campaign demonstrated the extent to which Imperial information control could manipulate even enhanced human populations. The establishment of systematic deception as Imperial policy marked a fundamental shift from governance based on shared objectives and mutual trust to governance based on information control and the manipulation of subject populations, including the enhanced humans who administered Imperial territories. The unexpected resistance that emerged from surviving Thunder Warrior support personnel created security challenges that Imperial forces had not anticipated. Enhanced human technicians, medical personnel and administrators, who had worked closely with Thunder Warrior units, began asking questions about their disappearance and expressing doubt about official explanations for their elimination. Some of these individuals possessed detailed knowledge of Thunder Warrior capabilities and medical conditions that contradicted Imperial propaganda about genetic instability and rebellion, creating potential security breaches that required containment through surveillance, intimidation, and in some cases elimination. The emergence of underground networks among Imperial personnel who questioned official accounts of Thunder Warrior elimination represented the first organized opposition to Imperial authority from within Imperial territories themselves. These networks were composed primarily of enhanced humans whose conditioning had not been sufficient to suppress their moral responses to witnessing or learning about systematic betrayal. Their activities included sharing information about the true circumstances of Thunder Warrior elimination and attempting to document evidence that contradicted official Imperial accounts. The resource relocation that occurred following Thunder Warrior elimination revealed the true economic costs of maintaining two different enhancement systems simultaneously. The facilities, personnel, and materials that had been devoted to Thunder Warrior support were immediately redirected toward expanding Proto-Astartes production, creating rapid acceleration in the development of replacement forces. However, the transition also revealed that Imperial resource management had been strained to its limits by the dual requirements, confirming that the elimination had been economically necessary regardless of its moral implications. The new security measures that were implemented following Thunder Warrior elimination demonstrated Imperial leadership's recognition that the betrayal had created ongoing risks that would require permanent management. Enhanced human personnel were subjected to increased psychological evaluation and surveillance designed to identify potential moral questioning or resistance before it could manifest in disloyal behavior. Communication systems were modified to prevent the formation of networks that might share information contradicting official Imperial accounts of Thunder Warrior elimination. The psychological counseling programs that were established for Imperial personnel experiencing trauma related to Thunder Warrior elimination represented the first systematic attempt to manage moral injury among enhanced human populations. These programs were designed not to address the ethical dimensions of Imperial actions, but to suppress moral awareness and questioning that might interfere with continued loyalty and effectiveness. The therapeutic techniques employed were specifically intended to eliminate conscience and moral reasoning that might conflict with Imperial objectives. The transformation of Imperial medical and psychological services from healing institutions designed to support enhanced human welfare into control mechanisms designed to suppress moral awareness represented a fundamental corruption of the relationship between Imperial authority and the populations that served Imperial objectives. The power vacuum that was created in former Thunder Warrior territories was filled by Proto-Astartes units whose unfamiliarity with local conditions and different operational methods created temporary instabilities that required careful management. The new enhanced warriors demonstrated superior capabilities in many areas, but they lacked the experience and local knowledge that had made Thunder Warriors effective administrators as well as soldiers. The transition period revealed that eliminating experienced personnel, regardless of the reasons, created practical problems that could not be easily resolved through superior technology or conditioning. The cover-up operations that were conducted to conceal evidence of Thunder Warrior elimination from external observers demonstrated the extent to which Imperial expansion had created enemies who were actively gathering intelligence about Imperial methods and capabilities. Coalition forces and remaining independent kingdoms were attempting to document Imperial actions that might be used for propaganda purposes or tactical advantage, creating ongoing security requirements that consumed resources and personnel that might otherwise have been devoted to expansion operations. The establishment of memorial services and commemorative activities designed to honor Thunder Warrior service while concealing the true circumstances of their elimination created ongoing requirements for systematic deception that affected all levels of Imperial society. Enhanced human personnel were required to participate in ceremonies that they knew were based on lies, creating psychological stress and moral conflicts that had to be managed through ongoing conditioning and surveillance. The beginning of historical revisionism designed to eliminate accurate records of Thunder Warrior elimination and replace them with accounts that supported official Imperial propaganda represented the first systematic attempt to control historical knowledge rather than simply controlling contemporary information. Archives were modified, witnesses were silenced or eliminated, and new accounts were created that would provide future Imperial populations with false information about the foundation events of Imperial history. The transformation of Imperial governance from leadership based on shared objectives and honest communication into administration based on systematic deception and the manipulation of historical knowledge established patterns that would define Imperial culture for millennia to come, creating a civilization built on lies that its own enhanced populations were required to perpetuate and believe. The psychological transformation of Imperial leadership following Thunder Warrior elimination was evidenced by the ease with which subsequent betrayals and eliminations were planned and implemented. The moral threshold that had been crossed at Mount Ararat established precedents that made future violence against Imperial servants seem like natural extensions of Imperial policy rather than moral crises requiring justification or hesitation. As Imperial territories adjusted to the new reality of governance based on systematic deception and the routine elimination of inconvenient servants, the character of Imperial civilization was being permanently altered in ways that would make the promise of unity and advancement increasingly hollow for all populations subject to Imperial authority. The genetic legacy of Thunder Warrior enhancement continued to influence Imperial military development long after the last warrior had been eliminated at Mount Ararat, as the research data and biological samples that had been preserved from their creation became foundational elements in the development of Astartes' genetic architecture. The cellular instabilities that had doomed the Thunder Warriors provided crucial lessons about the limitations of rapid genetic modification, while their superhuman capabilities demonstrated the theoretical possibilities that could be achieved through more refined enhancement techniques. Imperial geneticists studying Thunder Warrior remains identified specific genetic sequences and cellular structures that could be stabilized through different modification approaches, creating the scientific foundation for space marine enhancement protocols that would prove sustainable across centuries rather than decades. The technological innovations that had been developed to support Thunder Warrior operations found new applications throughout Imperial military and civilian systems, creating lasting improvements in Imperial capability that persisted long after their creators had been betrayed and eliminated. The specialized armor systems, enhanced weapons and medical support technologies that had been designed for superhuman soldiers were adapted for use by Proto-Astartes forces and enhanced human personnel, while the manufacturing techniques that had produced Thunder Warrior equipment became the basis for Imperial industrial expansion throughout the recovered territories of Terra. The cultural impact of Thunder Warrior's service and betrayal established patterns of loyalty and sacrifice that would define Imperial military culture for millennia to come. The myth of Thunder Warriors as perfect soldiers who had served with absolute dedication until their tragic loss to genetic instability became a foundational element of Imperial military ideology, inspiring later generations of enhanced warriors while concealing the true circumstances of their elimination. The psychological conditioning that had created Thunder Warrior loyalty was refined and incorporated into Astartes' training protocols, ensuring that future Imperial soldiers would demonstrate the same dedication while avoiding the independence that had made their predecessors potential security risks. The administrative precedents that had been established through Thunder Warrior elimination created institutional frameworks for managing the routine betrayal and elimination of Imperial servants who became inconvenient or obsolete. The bureaucratic procedures, security protocols, and propaganda techniques that had been developed for concealing systematic murder were incorporated into standard Imperial governance methods, creating a civilization that could eliminate entire populations while maintaining the appearance of benevolent administration. The enhanced human personnel who had participated in or witnessed Thunder Warrior elimination became the foundation of Imperial administrative classes that understood betrayal and violence as normal tools of governance rather than moral aberrations requiring justification. The transformation of Imperial governance from idealistic unification into systematic oppression was directly traceable to the precedents established through Thunder Warrior betrayal, as the willingness to eliminate loyal servants for practical convenience became the defining characteristic of Imperial authority for all subsequent generations. The ongoing conflicts that were created by Thunder Warrior elimination would continue to affect Imperial expansion and security for decades after Mount Ararat, as surviving support personnel, enhanced human witnesses, and coalition intelligence networks worked to expose and exploit Imperial vulnerability to moral criticism. The underground resistance movements that had formed among Imperial personnel who questioned official accounts of Thunder Warrior elimination evolved into persistent security threats that required ongoing resources and attention to contain, while coalition propaganda that documented Imperial betrayal of their own forces proved devastatingly effective in discouraging voluntary submission among Terra's remaining independent kingdoms. The psychological legacy of systematic betrayal began affecting Imperial enhanced human populations in ways that had not been anticipated during the planning of Thunder Warrior elimination. Enhanced individuals who had witnessed or learned about the betrayal experienced doubt and anxiety about their own security that interfered with their effectiveness as Imperial administrators and technicians. The recognition that loyal service provided no protection against elimination when Imperial objectives required it created chronic stress and reduced efficiency throughout Imperial systems, while the systematic deception that had been used to conceal the betrayal created communication problems that affected coordination between different levels of Imperial administration. The hidden survivors who had escaped Thunder Warrior elimination, or had been overlooked during the cleanup operations, created ongoing security challenges that would persist throughout the remainder of the Unification Wars and beyond. These individuals possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial methods, capabilities, and vulnerabilities that made them valuable assets for coalition forces and potential leaders for resistance movements within Imperial territories. Their continued existence provided evidence that contradicted Imperial propaganda about Thunder Warrior elimination, while creating the possibility that accurate accounts of Imperial betrayal might be preserved and disseminated to future generations. The genetic contamination that resulted from incorporating xenobiological material into Thunder Warrior enhancement protocols created long-term medical problems that affected subsequent enhancement programs and civilian populations throughout Imperial territories. The cellular instabilities that had been introduced through experimental modifications proved to be inheritable through normal reproduction, creating genetic disorders that appeared in the children and grandchildren of individuals who had been exposed to Thunder Warrior-derived enhancement techniques. These medical problems required ongoing treatment and monitoring that consumed Imperial resources while creating populations that were dependent on Imperial medical support for their survival. The industrial capacity that had been developed to support Thunder Warrior operations was repurposed for Astartes production, but the transition revealed structural problems in Imperial manufacturing that had been concealed by the emergency conditions of the Unification Wars. The resource consumption that had been required to maintain superhuman military forces was approaching the limits of Terra's capacity to provide raw materials, while the specialized facilities that produced enhanced warrior equipment were showing signs of wear and breakdown that suggested they had been operated beyond their design parameters during the emergency expansion period. The recognition that Imperial military effectiveness was dependent on resource consumption that exceeded Terra's long-term capacity to provide confirmed that expansion beyond Terra was not merely desirable but essential for Imperial survival, creating the strategic imperative that would drive the Great Crusade while establishing the pattern of expansion-dependent civilization that would characterize Imperial development for millennia. The religious and ideological movements that had emerged to justify Imperial expansion and genetic enhancement were forced to adapt their teachings to account for the elimination of warriors who had been portrayed as examples of Imperial perfection. The theological implications of systematic betrayal required complex rationalization that established Imperial authority as transcending normal moral limitations, creating religious foundations for absolute obedience to Imperial will regardless of the moral character of Imperial actions. These religious adaptations became the basis for Imperial cult development that would eventually provide spiritual justification for unlimited Imperial violence against any population that was deemed inconvenient or threatening. The educational systems that had been established in Imperial territories were modified to include instruction about Thunder Warrior service and sacrifice that concealed the true circumstances of their elimination, while promoting the values of loyalty and obedience that Imperial authority required from its enhanced human populations. The historical accounts that were taught to successive generations portrayed Thunder Warrior elimination as tragic but necessary, establishing cultural acceptance of Imperial violence as regrettable but justified when higher purposes required it. The communication networks that had been developed during Imperial expansion were adapted to include monitoring and control capabilities that could prevent the formation of resistance movements or the dissemination of information that contradicted Imperial propaganda. The surveillance systems that had been implemented to manage the aftermath of Thunder Warrior elimination became permanent features of Imperial administration, creating populations that were subject to constant observation and control by authorities who could eliminate them without warning or justification. The legal frameworks that had been established for Imperial governance were modified to include provisions that legalized the elimination of Imperial servants for security reasons or practical convenience, creating institutional protection for future betrayals while eliminating legal recourse for individuals who might be targeted for elimination. These legal changes established Imperial authority as unlimited by constitutional constraints or individual rights, creating governmental systems that could commit any action without legal consequence or procedural limitation. The institutional changes that resulted from Thunder Warrior elimination created Imperial governmental systems that were specifically designed to enable systematic violence against Imperial populations while maintaining the appearance of legitimate authority, establishing the foundation for the oppressive governance that would characterize Imperial rule throughout its subsequent history. The economic systems that had been developed to support Imperial expansion incorporated the lessons learned from Thunder Warrior resource management, creating more efficient but also more ruthless allocation methods that prioritized Imperial objectives over individual welfare or moral considerations. The willingness to eliminate expensive personnel when more efficient alternatives became available established precedents for treating all Imperial populations as expendable resources whose value was determined solely by their contribution to Imperial objectives. As the Unification Wars approached their conclusion and Imperial forces prepared for expansion beyond Terra, the precedents established through Thunder Warrior betrayal were becoming embedded in Imperial institutional culture as normal and necessary features of effective governance, ensuring that the moral corruption that had begun with the elimination of loyal soldiers would spread throughout the expanding empire and define its character for all future generations. The archaeological evidence that occasionally surfaces in the deepest archives of the Imperial Palace continues to contradict official Imperial accounts of Thunder Warrior service and elimination, creating ongoing tension between historical truth and institutional mythology that affects Imperial governance even in the 41st millennium. Fragmentary records that have survived multiple purges and reformations preserve testimony from enhanced human witnesses who documented the systematic nature of Thunder Warrior betrayal, while genetic analysis of preserved biological samples reveals the true scope of experimental enhancement programs that incorporated xenobiological material and Dark Age technology into human genetic architecture. These discoveries create persistent challenges to Imperial historical narratives that require ongoing suppression and management by the Inquisition and other Imperial security organizations. The genetic markers that appear in certain Imperial populations throughout the galaxy suggest that Thunder Warrior genetic material was more widely disseminated than official records acknowledge, creating bloodlines that carry enhanced capabilities along with the instabilities that doomed their enhanced ancestors. Medical examinations of individuals from these populations reveal cellular structures and metabolic processes that are inconsistent with normal human genetics or standard Imperial enhancement techniques, while their psychological profiles demonstrate characteristics that parallel Thunder Warrior conditioning despite having no documented exposure to Imperial military training. The existence of these populations raises questions about the completeness of Thunder Warrior elimination and the possibility that surviving genetic material was deliberately preserved or escaped Imperial control. The technology that has been rediscovered in forgotten Imperial facilities occasionally includes equipment and documentation that reveals capabilities exceeding those attributed to Thunder Warriors in official records, suggesting that the true extent of their enhancement and the sophistication of Imperial genetic research during the Unification Wars remains classified at levels that transcend normal Imperial security protocols. Manufacturing specifications for Thunder Warrior equipment indicate production capabilities that would have required industrial resources exceeding official estimates of Imperial capacity during the early 30th millennium, while medical protocols for enhanced warrior maintenance describe treatments that utilize principles not documented in standard Imperial genetic modification procedures. The psychological legacy of Thunder Warrior betrayal continues to affect Imperial military culture through institutional traditions and conditioning protocols that were originally developed to prevent similar loyalty conflicts among Astartes forces. The absolute obedience that characterizes Space Marine psychology was specifically designed to eliminate the independence and moral reasoning that had made Thunder Warriors potential security risks, while the isolation from normal human society that defines Astartes culture was intended to prevent the formation of personal relationships that might create divided loyalties. The success of these conditioning methods in creating perfectly loyal soldiers also created psychological dependencies that make Space Marines incapable of questioning Imperial authority, even when their moral intuitions suggest that Imperial actions violate the principles they were created to defend. The recognition that Imperial military effectiveness remains dependent on psychological conditioning techniques that were originally developed to prevent soldiers from questioning systematic betrayal reveals the extent to which the precedents established during Thunder Warrior elimination continue to define Imperial character and capability in the current era. The strategic implications of Thunder Warrior betrayal for understanding Imperial governance become apparent through analysis of subsequent purges, betrayals, and eliminations that have characterized Imperial history throughout its expansion across the galaxy. The willingness to eliminate inconvenient servants that was established through Thunder Warrior elimination created patterns that can be observed in the treatment of the Lost Legions, the purging of Imperial army commanders who became too powerful or independent, and the routine elimination of civilian populations whose loyalty or usefulness became questionable. The institutional mechanisms that were developed for concealing systematic violence against imperial populations have been refined and expanded to enable genocide on planetary scales while maintaining imperial claims to legitimate authority. The connection between Thunder Warrior elimination and the character of the Emperor himself remains one of the most significant mysteries affecting imperial ideology and governance in the current era. The being who had emerged from the Age of Strife, promising unity and advancement for humanity, demonstrated through his personal involvement in Thunder Warrior betrayal that his commitment to human welfare was subordinate to abstract imperial objectives, establishing precedents that continue to justify unlimited imperial violence against any population that conflicts with imperial goals. The theological implications of this revelation for the imperial cult and the worship of the emperor as a benevolent deity create ongoing tension between religious devotion and historical awareness that affects imperial spiritual life throughout the galaxy. The parallels between Thunder Warrior elimination and the potential obsolescence of current Imperial military forces create strategic concerns that affect Imperial planning and resource allocation. In the 41st millennium, Space Marines, despite their superior stability compared to Thunder Warriors, demonstrate aging and psychological changes that suggest they may not be permanent solutions to Imperial military requirements, while the Primarchs whose return has reinvigorated Imperial expansion possess knowledge of Imperial methods and history that could make them potential security risks if their loyalty ever became questionable. The precedents established through Thunder Warrior betrayal suggest that even the most loyal and effective Imperial servants could be eliminated if practical considerations made their continued existence inconvenient for Imperial objectives. The question of whether the Imperium learned the appropriate lessons from Thunder Warrior elimination remains crucial for understanding Imperial capacity for reform and adaptation in the current era. The institutional changes that resulted from the betrayal established governmental systems that prioritized efficiency and control over moral considerations or individual welfare, creating imperial civilization that could maintain stability and expansion through systematic oppression while preventing the formation of resistance movements or alternative power structures. The success of these methods in enabling imperial survival for 10 millennia suggests that Thunder Warrior elimination was strategically justified. But the moral costs continue to affect imperial culture and capability in ways that may ultimately prove more damaging than the immediate benefits. The philosophical questions raised by Thunder Warrior betrayal about the relationship between individual rights and collective objectives remain relevant to imperial governance and expansion in the current era. The decision to eliminate loyal servants for practical convenience established imperial authority as unlimited by moral constraints or individual claims to protection, creating governmental systems that can sacrifice any population for abstract goals while maintaining claims to legitimate authority. The success of imperial expansion suggests that this approach may be necessary for human survival in a hostile galaxy. But the psychological and cultural costs create ongoing problems that affect imperial effectiveness and stability. The continuing relevance of Thunder Warrior elimination for understanding imperial character and capability in the 41st millennium demonstrates that the precedents established during the Unification Wars remain foundational elements of imperial civilization, defining the relationship between imperial authority and imperial populations in ways that transcend the specific circumstances of Terra's ancient wars. The implications of Thunder Warrior betrayal for the future of human civilization extend beyond imperial governance to affect the fundamental question of whether enhanced humanity can maintain moral and ethical standards that distinguish it from the Xenos threats it was created to oppose. The transformation of imperial governance from idealistic unification into systematic oppression represents a form of spiritual corruption that may be more dangerous to humanity's long-term survival than any external threat, as it creates civilizational patterns that prioritize power and efficiency over the moral and ethical development that had previously defined human cultural evolution. The legacy of the Unification Wars and Thunder Warrior elimination continues to shape imperial responses to current threats and opportunities, as the institutional mechanisms and psychological patterns that were established through systematic betrayal provide templates for addressing contemporary challenges through violence and deception rather than cooperation and honest communication. The success of these methods in enabling imperial survival suggests their continued utility, but their moral costs create ongoing vulnerabilities that may ultimately prove more dangerous than the immediate threats they were designed to address. The question of whether the Emperor's vision of human unity and advancement can be achieved through methods that were established during Thunder Warrior elimination remains one of the most significant challenges facing Imperial civilization in the current era. The precedents that were set during the Unification Wars created governmental systems that can maintain order and expansion through systematic oppression, but they also created spiritual and cultural limitations that may prevent Imperial humanity from achieving the greatness that was promised during Terra's ancient recovery from the Age of Strife. Final statement. In the grim darkness of the far future, the shadows of Mount Ararat still fall across every Imperial decision, every Space Marine deployment, every act of governance that prioritizes Imperial objectives over individual lives. The Thunder Warriors who died believing in the promise of unity became the foundation not of humanity's salvation, but of its transformation into something that might no longer deserve the name human. Their betrayal established the moral architecture of an empire that would span the galaxy while losing its soul, creating a civilization that could conquer the stars while destroying the very humanity it claimed to protect. The price of unity, paid in the blood of the Emperor's most loyal servants, continues to echo through the millennia, as a reminder that even humanity's greatest triumphs can become the source of its most profound corruption, leaving the Imperium forever marked by the original sin of choosing power over loyalty, efficiency over honor, and survival over the moral foundations that had once made humanity worth saving.